A Journey to Serenity, Part 1, The Restless Mind. Do you ever feel like your mind is a prison? Like no matter what you achieve or acquire, true peace remains just out of reach? You chase success, relationships, experiences, yet that inner turbulence never stops. The promotion doesn't quiet the anxiety. The relationship doesn't fill the emptiness. The vacation ends, and you're right back where you started, restless, searching, somehow always wanting more. If you recognize this feeling, you're experiencing something that has haunted humanity for millennia. This restlessness isn't a personal failing or a sign that something is wrong with you. It's the human condition itself. And understanding this is your first step toward genuine freedom. 2,500 years ago, three remarkable traditions emerged that would forever change how we understand the mind and its potential for peace. In ancient Greece, Plato gazed into the nature reality itself. In the Roman Empire, the Stoics developed an unshakable philosophy of inner strength. And in ancient India, a prince named Siddhartha discovered truths about suffering that would transform him into the Buddha. These weren't armchair philosophers theorizing about abstract concepts. They were human beings, just like us, wrestle with the same fundamental questions. Why do we suffer? Why is contentment so elusive? And most importantly, is genuine serenity actually possible? Here's what makes their insights revolutionary. They discover that the source of our restlessness isn't external. It's not your circumstances, your relationships, or your bank account that keeps you up at night. The prison of the restless mind is built from the inside, constructed from our own thoughts, beliefs, and patterns of attention. And if the prison is built from within, then the key to freedom lies within as well. Let me tell you about Sarah. She's 34, successful by every external measure. Corner office, six-figure salary, beautiful apartment in the city. Her Instagram feed looks like a lifestyle magazine. Yet every morning, she wakes up a knot in her stomach, a vague but persistent sense that something essential is missing. Sarah represents millions of us who have achieved what we thought we wanted, only to discover that external success doesn't translate to internal peace. We've been sold a lie, that happiness comes from having more, being more, doing more. But Plato would have recognized Sarah's dilemma immediately. She's living what he called the unexamined life, pursuing shadows while remaining blind to the light that could set her free. The Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius would have understood her midnight anxiety. Here was a man who literally ruled the world, yet his personal diary, what we now call meditations, reveals someone constantly working to maintain inner peace amidst external chaos. He wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." And the Buddha, he would have smiled with recognition. Sarah's suffering is exactly what he diagnosed as dukkha, the fundamental unsatisfactoriness that pervades human existence when we mistake the temporary for the permanent, when we grasp at experiences that by their very nature cannot provide lasting fulfillment. But here's where it gets interesting. You might think, well, if this is just a human condition, if everyone feels this way, then I guess I just have to accept being miserable. Wrong. The reason Plato, the Stoics, and Buddha are still studied today, the reason their insights have survived for over 2 millennia, is because they didn't just diagnose the problem. They discovered the cure. They found that serenity isn't a feeling you stumble upon by accident. It's not a temporary state that comes and goes based on circumstances. True serenity is a way of being that you can cultivate, develop, and maintain regardless of what's happening around you. Think of it this way. Imagine you've been trying to fill a bucket with holes in the bottom. No matter how much water you pour in, it never stays full. Most of us spend our entire lives pouring frantically. More achievements, more possessions, more experiences, without ever realizing that the real solution isn't to pour faster, it's to fix the holes. Plato taught us to see the holes clearly, to distinguish between what's real and what's illusion. The Stoics showed us how to stop wasting energy on what we can't control and focus entirely on what we can. Buddha revealed why we keep pouring in the first place and how to find fulfillment that doesn't depend on keeping the bucket full. Now, I want to be completely honest with you about what we're undertaking together. This isn't a quick fix or a life hack. The path to genuine serenity isn't found in a weekend workshop or a 30-day challenge. It's a fundamental reorientation of how you understand yourself and your relationship to reality. The restless mind didn't develop overnight, and it won't be transformed overnight. But, and this is crucial, every single step on this journey will bring immediate benefits. Unlike the temporary highs of external achievements, each insight you gain, each practice you master, becomes a permanent part of your inner landscape. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal, "At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being." This wasn't abstract philosophy to him. It was practical wisdom for dealing with the exact same struggles you face. Difficult people, challenging circumstances, the gap between how you want life to be and how it actually is. Plato spent his life teaching others to question their assumptions, to think more clearly, to see beyond surface appearances. Why? Because he understood that most of our suffering comes from mistaking our interpretations of reality for reality itself. Buddha dedicated 45 years to teaching a simple but profound truth. Suffering is optional. Pain may be inevitable, but the mental anguish we create around pain, that's a choice. And it's a choice you can learn to make differently. These weren't monks hiding in monasteries or philosophers locked in ivory towers. Plato engaged with politics and society. Many Stoics were emperors, generals, and business people. Buddha taught kings and peasants alike. Their wisdom was forged in the real world, tested against the same pressures and challenges you face. And here's what they discovered. Serenity isn't the absence of problems. It's not a Zen-like state where nothing bothers you. True serenity is the presence of inner stability that allows you to engage fully with life while remaining centered in yourself. It's the ability to care deeply without being devastated by outcomes. It's strength that doesn't depend on controlling circumstances. Consider David, a father of 3 who lost his job during a corporate restructuring. By conventional measures, this should have been devastating. His income disappeared, his career trajectory was disrupted, his family security was threatened. Yet David had spent years studying Stoic philosophy. Instead of spiraling into panic, he asked himself Marcus Aurelius' essential question: what aspects of the situation can I actually control? He couldn't control the company's decision or the economic forces that led to the layoffs, but he could control his response. He could control how he spent his time during the job search. He could control his attitude around his children, choosing not to burden them with his anxiety. He could control whether he used this disruption as an opportunity to reassess his career path or simply scrambled to recreate his old situation. David's serenity didn't come from pretending everything was fine or suppressing his natural concerns about the future. It came from clearly distinguishing between what was within his power and what wasn't, then pouring all his energy into the former while accepting the latter. This is a practical wisdom that emerges when ancient philosophy meets modern life. It's not about becoming emotionally numb or adopting a fatalistic attitude. It's about developing what the Stoics called the discipline of desire, wanting what happens rather than demanding that what you want must happen. Buddha would have recognized David's approach, though he would have described it differently. From a Buddhist perspective, David was practicing non-attachment, engaging fully with his responsibilities while releasing his grip on outcomes. He was experiencing what Buddhists call the freedom of desirelessness, not the absence of preferences, but the absence of suffering when preferences aren't met. Plato would have seen David as someone emerging from the cave of illusions into the light of reality. Instead of mistaking his job title for his identity, his salary for his worth, or his career plans for ultimate truth, David was learning to see these as temporary forms, important for practical purposes, but not the source of his fundamental well-being. But let's be honest about the challenges. Sarah, whom we met earlier, didn't transform overnight. When she first encountered these ideas, her initial reaction was skepticism. This sounds great in theory, she thought, but you don't understand my situation. My boss is impossible. My mother is demanding. My rent is astronomical. Easy to be serene when you're not dealing with real problems. This reaction is completely understandable and completely missing the point. The ancient philosophers weren't teaching escape from problems. They were teaching a different relationship with problems. Marcus Aurelius faced plagues, wars, and political intrigue. Buddha grew up witnessing poverty, illness, and death. Plato lived through the decline of Athenian democracy and the execution of his beloved teacher, Socrates. Their serenity wasn't built in the absence of difficulty. It was forged in the furnace of real-world challenges. They discovered that external circumstances have far less power over our inner state than we typically believe. But, and this is crucial, accessing this power requires training, just like building physical strength requires consistent exercise. The restless mind is like an untrained muscle. It's been conditioned by years of reactive patterns, automatic thoughts, and unconscious habits. When difficulty arises, it immediately jumps to worst-case scenarios. When desires aren't met, it creates elaborate stories about why this proves life is unfair. When faced with uncertainty, it generates anxiety rather than curiosity. But just as you can train your body to become stronger and more resilient, you can train your mind to become calmer and more stable. The ancient philosophers developed specific practices for this training, practices that modern neuroscience is now validating as genuinely effective for rewiring the brain toward greater well-being. Over the next 9 parts of this journey, we'll explore these practices in detail. We'll walk through Plato's cave together, learning to distinguish between the shadows on the wall and the reality that casts them. We'll train alongside the Stoics, developing unshakable inner strength that doesn't depend on external validation. We'll sit with the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, understanding the mechanics of suffering and the path to liberation. But remember, this isn't just intellectual exploration. These insights are only valuable if they translate into a different way of living. Philosophy without practice is just sophisticated entertainment. The goal isn't to impress people at dinner parties with your knowledge of ancient wisdom. The goal is to wake up tomorrow morning with a little less anxiety, a little more clarity, and a genuine sense that you're living in alignment with what truly matters. Your restless mind isn't your enemy. It's not a flaw to be eliminated or a weakness to be ashamed of. It's the raw material of awakening, the starting point of genuine transformation. The very dissatisfaction that drives you to seek something deeper is what the philosophers call divine discontent. The soul's recognition that it's capable of more than its current limitations allow. The journey to serenity begins with a single step: the willingness to question whether the way you've been thinking about happiness, success, and the good life might not be the only way. The willingness to consider that 25 centuries of philosophical wisdom might have something practical to offer your very modern problems. Are you ready to begin? A Journey to Serenity, Part 2, Plato's Cave, Escaping the Shadows of Illusion. Imagine you've lived your entire life in a dark underground cave. You're chained to a wall, unable to turn your head, forced to stare straight ahead at shadows dancing on the stone surface in front of you. Behind you, unseen, people carry objects past a fire, and their shadows flicker on the wall. This is all you've ever known. These shadows are your reality. Now imagine someone breaks your chains, forces you to turn around, and drags you toward the fire. The light burns your eyes. The real objects casting the shadows seem strange and incomprehensible compared to familiar shadows you've always known. This person then pulls you further up a steep path, out of the cave entirely, into the blazing sunlight of the world above. This is Plato's allegory of the cave, and it's not just an ancient thought experiment. It's a precise diagnosis of the human condition and a roadmap to liberation that's as relevant today as it was 2,400 years ago. You are the prisoner. Your restless mind, your endless dissatisfaction, your sense that something fundamental is missing. These are symptoms of mistaking shadows for reality. And the path to serenity begins with understanding what those shadows actually are. Let's start with the most seductive shadow of all: the belief that happiness comes from external achievements. We live in a culture that has turned the shadow into gospel. Get the right job, find the right person, buy the right things, live in the right neighborhood, and you'll finally be content. We chase these shadows with desperate intensity, never questioning whether they're real or just projections on the cave wall. Consider Michael, a successful lawyer who spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder. Each promotion promised to be the one that would finally bring satisfaction. Each salary increase was supposed to quiet the voice in his head that whispered, "This isn't enough." The corner office, the luxury car, the expensive vacation. Each achievement cast a shadow that looked like fulfillment, but when Michael reached for it, his hands closed on nothing. Plato would have recognized Michael's predicament immediately. He was pursuing what the Greeks called phantoms, images that appear real but have no substance. The promotion isn't happiness. It's a shadow of happiness cast by our desire for recognition. The luxury car isn't security. It's a shadow of security cast by our fear of being ordinary. The expensive vacation isn't peace. It's a shadow of peace cast by our desperate need to escape our everyday dissatisfaction. But here's what makes this insight truly revolutionary. Plato wasn't advocating for poverty or asceticism. He wasn't saying that success, beauty, or pleasure are inherently bad. He was pointing out that when we mistake these temporary experiences for permanent sources of well-being, we remain forever trapped in the cave of illusion. The real objects casting these shadows, what Plato called the forms, are eternal, perfect, and unchanging. The form of beauty isn't found in any particular beautiful thing. It's the unchanging principle that makes beautiful things beautiful. The form of justice isn't found in any specific just act. It's the eternal standard by which all acts are measured. And the form of the good, the highest of all forms, is the source of meaning, truth, and genuine fulfillment that exists beyond all temporary manifestations. This might sound abstract, but it has profound practical implications. When you understand that no external achievement can provide the lasting satisfaction you're seeking, you stop expecting it to. You can enjoy success when it comes without being devastated when it goes. You can appreciate beauty without becoming attached to possessing it. You can work toward goals without making your happiness dependent on achieving them. This is what Plato meant by the examined life. It's not enough to live. You must examine what you're actually pursuing and why. Most people spend their entire lives chasing shadows without ever questioning whether what they're chasing is real. They accumulate achievements, experiences, and possessions, then wonder why the promise of fulfillment never arrives. Let's examine the shadow of romantic love, one of the most powerful illusions in the cave. Our culture teaches us that finding the right person will complete us, that romantic love is the ultimate source of meaning and happiness. Movies, songs, and stories reinforce this shadow until it seems more real than reality itself. But watch what happens when people organize their entire sense of well-being around romantic relationships. They become anxious when their partner seems distant, devastated when relationships end, and constantly searching for someone to make them happy. They're chasing a shadow, mistaking the temporary experience of romantic excitement for permanent fulfillment. Plato understood that true love isn't about finding someone to complete you. It's about recognizing the form of love itself, the eternal, unchanging principle that exists beyond any particular relationship. When you touch this deeper reality, you can love without possessing, care without controlling, and appreciate your partner without making them responsible for your happiness. This doesn't make relationships less important. It makes them more authentic. Instead of using your partner to fill an internal void, you bring your own completeness to the relationship. Instead of loving because you need something, you love because you have something to give. This is what the Greeks called agape, love that flows from abundance rather than scarcity. The same principle applies to the shadow of social media validation. Every day, millions of people craft images of their lives designed to generate likes, comments, and shares. They chase the shadow of approval, mistaking the temporary dopamine hit of digital validation for genuine self-worth. But the approval of strangers on the internet isn't real connection. It's just a shadow cast by our deep need to belong and be valued. The form of worth exists beyond any external validation. Your fundamental value doesn't fluctuate based on how many people approve of your latest post. It doesn't increase with success or decrease with failure. It's not earned through achievement or lost through mistakes. Recognizing this unchanging reality frees you from the exhausting cycle of performing for approval. But here's where most people get stuck. They intellectually understand that external achievements won't bring lasting happiness, but they don't know what will. They see through the shadows, but can't yet perceive the light that casts them. They find themselves in what philosophers call the middle space, no longer satisfied with illusions, but not yet connected to deeper reality. This is where Plato's distinction between knowledge and wisdom becomes crucial. Knowledge is information about the shadows, understanding their mechanics, their temporary nature, their ultimate emptiness. Wisdom is direct perception of the light itself, experience of eternal forms that exist beyond all changing phenomena. You can't think your way to wisdom. You can't analyze your way to the form of the good. These realities must be directly experienced through what Plato called dialectic, a process of rigorous self-examination that gradually strips away false beliefs until only truth remains. The dialectical process begins with recognizing your own ignorance. Socrates, Plato's teacher, was famous for saying, "I know that I know nothing." This wasn't false modesty. It was profound wisdom. As long as you think you already know what will make you happy, you'll keep chasing shadows. The journey to serenity begins with admitting that your current strategies aren't working. Lisa discovered this truth during what she calls her dark night of the soul. She had everything on her checklist: successful career, loving husband, beautiful home, healthy children. Yet she felt profoundly empty, going through the motions of life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow within. For months, she tried to fix the problem by acquiring more shadows, a new hobby, a fitness routine, a redecorated living room. Nothing worked. Finally, in desperation, she began asking different questions. Instead of "what else do I need to feel fulfilled?" she started wondering, "why doesn't having everything I thought I wanted actually satisfy me?" This shift from seeking more shadows to questioning the nature of shadows themselves marked her first step out of the cave. Lisa's questioning led her to examine her fundamental assumptions about happiness. She realized she had been operating from a belief that fulfillment comes from external arrangements, having the right combination of circumstances, relationships, and achievements. But this belief itself was just another shadow, a projection of her deeper desire for something that no external arrangement could provide. As Lisa continued her examination, she began to glimpse what Plato called the good itself, not good things, but the source of goodness in all things. She started to experience moments of profound peace that didn't depend on anything in her external world. These weren't emotions or feelings that came and went. They were recognition of something that was always already present, something that had been obscured but never actually absent. This is what Plato meant by anamnesis, remembering what you've always known but forgotten. The form of the good isn't something foreign that you need to acquire. It's your deepest nature that's been covered over by layers of false identification with shadows. The journey isn't about becoming someone different. It's about remembering who you actually are beneath all the accumulated illusions. But let's be honest about the challenges of this journey. When you first glimpse the light beyond the shadows, it's often uncomfortable, even painful. Your eyes have adjusted to the darkness of the cave, and the brightness of reality can be overwhelming. There's a reason why. In Plato's allegory, the prisoner initially resists being dragged toward the fire. Your entire sense of identity has been built around pursuing and achieving certain shadows. Your social connections, your daily routines, your future plans. All of these may be organized around illusions. When you begin to see through these illusions, you might feel disoriented, like you're losing your grip on what you thought was solid ground. This disorientation is actually a positive sign. It means you're beginning to distinguish between what's real and what's merely projected. The anxiety you feel isn't evidence that you're going the wrong direction. It's a natural response to an identity that's been built on shifting sand to the recognition of bedrock. The path through this disorientation requires what Plato called philosophical courage, the willingness to follow truth wherever it leads, even when it dismantles your cherished beliefs about how life works. It's the courage to admit that you might have been wrong about fundamental things, that the strategies you've been using to find happiness might actually be keeping you trapped in misery. This courage isn't about becoming harsh or cynical toward the world of shadows. Some of the most compassionate people in history have been those who saw through illusions while remaining deeply engaged with the world. They understood that the shadows aren't evil. They're just not what they appear to be. Money isn't bad. Mistaking money for security is what causes suffering. Relationships aren't wrong. Expecting them to provide what only the form of love can provide leads to disappointment. When you begin to distinguish between shadows and reality, something remarkable happens. You can participate in the world of changing phenomena without being imprisoned by it. You can work toward goals without making your peace dependent on achieving them. You can love people without needing them to complete you. You can enjoy pleasures without becoming addicted to them. This is what Plato called the philosopher's return to the cave. After experiencing the light of the forms, the liberated prisoner doesn't stay in the sunlit world above. They return to the cave to help others recognize the difference between shadows and reality. But now they move through the cave with a fundamentally different relationship to the shadows on the wall. They're no longer hypnotized by the dancing images. They can see the fire that casts them, the objects that create them, and ultimately the sun that illuminates everything. This doesn't make them withdrawn or otherworldly. It makes them more effective, more compassionate, and genuinely helpful to those still entranced by illusions. The journey from shadow to reality isn't a one-time transformation. It's an ongoing process of remembering and forgetting, seeing clearly and getting caught up in illusions again, touching eternal forms and then losing sight of them in the midst of daily concerns. This is natural and expected. The goal isn't to permanently escape the cave, but to develop the capacity to recognize when you're mistaking shadows for reality and to gently redirect your attention toward the light. Your restless mind, your endless dissatisfaction, your sense that something is missing. These aren't problems to be solved by acquiring better shadows. They're invitations to question the nature of shadows themselves, to investigate what you're actually seeking beneath all your specific desires and fears. The serenity you long for isn't waiting at the end of your next achievement. It's not hidden in your perfect relationship or your ideal circumstances. It's the light that makes all seeing possible, the eternal good that gives meaning to all temporary goods, the unchanging reality that you are beneath all the changing roles you play. In our next exploration, we'll discover how this Platonic insight prepares us for the Stoic path, learning not just to see reality clearly, but to align our will with what we discover there. The philosopher who emerges from Plato's cave is ready for the discipline that Marcus Aurelius practiced in his tent. The art of wanting what happens rather than demanding that what we want must happen. A Journey to Serenity, Part 3, The Philosopher's Turn, Seeing Beyond Appearances. The moment of awakening is never gentle. In Plato's cave, when the prisoner's chains are first broken and they're forced to turn around, their immediate reaction isn't gratitude, it's pain. The fire that has been casting shadows hurts their eyes. The real objects seem distorted compared to familiar shadows they've always known. Given the choice, most prisoners would gladly return to their chains rather than endure the discomfort of seeing clearly. This is a philosopher's turn, the pivotal moment when you stop pursuing shadows and start examining the nature of reality itself. It's the most crucial step on the journey to serenity, and it's almost always accompanied by what mystics call the dark night of the soul. When you begin to see through the illusions that have organized your entire life, the initial result isn't peace, it's disorientation. Consider Rebecca, a marketing executive who had built her identity around being indispensable at work. She was the first to arrive, the last to leave, the one who could solve any crisis. Her self-worth was entirely tied to her professional competence, her value as a human being measured by her productivity. Then she had her philosopher's turn during a routine performance review. Her manager, intending to be encouraging, said, "Rebecca, you're so valuable to us. I honestly don't know what we'd do without you." Instead of feeling flattered, Rebecca felt a chill of recognition. She realized she had become completely dependent on being needed by others. Her entire sense of identity was built on something she couldn't control, other people's opinions of her usefulness. That night, she couldn't sleep. For the first time in years, she asked herself a question that cut through all her familiar assumptions. Who am I when I'm not performing, achieving, or being useful to someone? The question terrified her because she couldn't answer it. She had spent so long being what others needed that she had no idea who she actually was. This is a philosopher's turn in action. It's the moment when you stop asking, how can I get better at playing this game? And start asking, is this the right game to be playing at all? It's when you cease trying to optimize your shadow-chasing strategies and begin questioning whether shadows are worth chasing in the first place. Plato understood that this questioning couldn't remain abstract. It had to become personal, immediate, and sometimes brutally honest. He developed what became known as the Socratic method, a form of inquiry that systematically dismantles false beliefs by exposing their internal contradictions. But this method isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's designed to create a crisis of understanding that forces you to confront the gap between what you think you know and what you actually know. The Socratic method begins with a simple but devastating question. What is X? What is justice? What is courage? What is love? What is success? What is happiness? These seem like straightforward questions until you try to answer them precisely. Then you discover that most of your deepest convictions are built on definitions you've never actually examined. Take happiness, for instance. If someone asked you to define happiness, you might say it's a feeling of contentment, joy, or satisfaction. But then the Socratic questioning begins. Is happiness just a feeling? If so, how can it be a worthy goal for a whole life when feelings are temporary and constantly changing? Can you be truly happy while experiencing sadness? If happiness depends on external circumstances, are you really in control of your own well-being? As you try to answer these questions, you realize that your definition of happiness might be more complex or more confused than you initially thought. Maybe happiness isn't just a feeling but a state of flourishing, a life lived in accordance with your deepest values. But then new questions arise. What are your deepest values? How do you know they're worth pursuing? What if your values themselves are just cultural programming that you've never questioned? This is where the philosopher's turn becomes simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberation comes from realizing that you don't have to remain trapped by unexamined assumptions. You can think for yourself, question everything, and potentially discover truths that are more solid than the shifting opinions around you. The terror comes from recognizing how much of your life has been built on foundations you never bothered to inspect. David, a successful businessman, experienced this during what should have been his moment of triumph. After 20 years of building his company, he finally achieved the exit he had been working toward, selling his business for enough money to retire comfortably. But instead of feeling accomplished, he felt empty. The goal that had organized 2 decades of his life was suddenly gone, and he didn't know what came next. His philosopher's turn came when he asked himself, what was I actually pursuing all those years? He had assumed he was working toward financial security, but he already had more money than he could spend. He thought he was building something meaningful, but the new owners immediately changed everything he had created. He believed he was proving his worth, but to whom? And why did he need to prove it? The more David examined his motivations, the more he realized he had been chasing shadows without ever questioning what was casting them. His drive for success was really a flight from the fear of being ordinary. His accumulation of wealth was an attempt to create security in an inherently insecure world. His business achievements were efforts to construct an identity that would outlast his physical existence. None of these motivations were wrong, but they were all based on fundamental misconceptions about the nature of security, identity, and meaning. David's philosopher's turn involved recognizing that the successful businessman was just one temporary role he had been playing, not his essential nature. The money, the recognition, the sense of accomplishment. These were all just shadows cast by his deeper desire for something that no external achievement could provide. This recognition is what Plato called the beginning of true philosophy, literally, love of wisdom. But wisdom, in this context, doesn't mean having more information or being clever about worldly matters. It means seeing clearly into the nature of reality itself, including the reality of your own being. The philosopher's turn requires what might be called cognitive courage, the willingness to follow rational inquiry wherever it leads, even when it challenges your most cherished beliefs about yourself and your world. This isn't the courage of a warrior charging into battle. It's a subtler but perhaps more demanding courage of someone willing to admit they might be fundamentally wrong about things they've never questioned. Sarah, whom we met earlier, discovered this when she began applying Socratic questioning to her relationship patterns. She had spent years frustrated with men who seemed unable to commit, wondering why she kept attracting the wrong type. Her philosopher's turn came when she asked herself, what am I actually looking for in a relationship? Initially, her answer seemed obvious. I want someone who will love me, support me, and build a life with me. But as she continued questioning, deeper layers emerged. Why did she need someone else to love her? What was she trying to get from external validation that she couldn't provide for herself? What did building a life together actually mean, and why couldn't she build a meaningful life on her own? The questioning revealed that she had been unconsciously trying to use relationships to fill an internal sense of incompleteness. She was attracted to uncommitted men, not despite their unavailability, but because of it. Their emotional distance allowed her to maintain the fantasy that if only she could win their full commitment, she would finally feel whole. She was chasing the shadow of completion through another person instead of discovering the completeness that was already present within her own being. This recognition was initially devastating. It meant acknowledging that many of her romantic disappointments had been self-created, that she had been unconsciously sabotaging her own chances for genuine partnership. But this same recognition was ultimately liberating. Once she stopped expecting relationships to complete her, she became available for authentic connection based on abundance rather than need. The philosopher's turn isn't just about examining your desires and motivations. It's about questioning the very framework through which you understand reality. Plato taught that most people live in what he called the world of becoming, the realm of constant change where everything is always in flux. In this world, you can never find lasting satisfaction because everything you grasp eventually changes or disappears. But beyond the world of becoming, Plato argued, lies the world of being, the realm of eternal forms that remain constant while everything else shifts. The form of beauty doesn't age or decay. The form of justice isn't corrupted by politics. The form of love doesn't depend on the changing emotions of particular relationships. These forms represent the unchanging principles that give meaning and structure to the changing world of appearances. The philosopher's turn involves learning to orient yourself toward the world of being rather than getting lost in the world of becoming. This doesn't mean rejecting the physical world or becoming indifferent to changing circumstances. It means recognizing that your deepest fulfillment comes from aligning with eternal principles rather than chasing temporary phenomena. Marcus, a father struggling with his teenage daughter's rebellion, experienced this shift during a particularly difficult argument. His daughter had been staying out past curfew. Her grades were declining, and she seemed to treat every parental guideline as a personal attack. His initial response was to tighten control, impose stricter rules, and demand immediate compliance. The more he pushed, the more she resisted. His philosopher's turn came when he asked himself, what am I actually trying to accomplish here? He realized he had been trying to control outcomes he couldn't control, his daughter's choices, her attitude, even her happiness. He was operating from the assumption that good parenting meant producing specific results in his child's behavior and academic performance. But as he examined this assumption, he recognized it was based on mistaking shadows for reality. His daughter's grades weren't his worth as a father. Her temporary rebellion wasn't evidence of his failure. His ability to control her behavior wasn't the measure of his love for her. When Marcus shifted his attention from the changing circumstances of his daughter's adolescence to the unchanging principles of genuine love and guidance, everything changed. Instead of trying to force compliance, he began modeling the qualities he hoped to see in her. Instead of reacting to her emotional outbursts, he responded from a place of steady compassion. He stopped taking her behavior personally and started seeing it as a natural process of a young person learning to establish her own identity. This shift didn't immediately solve all their conflicts, but it transformed the quality of their relationship. His daughter began to trust that his love wasn't conditional on her behavior, and gradually she started seeking his guidance rather than resisting it. Marcus discovered what Plato taught. When you align with eternal principles rather than chasing changing outcomes, you become a source of stability in an unstable world. The philosopher's turn also requires recognizing the difference between knowledge and opinion. In our information-saturated age, we often mistake having strong opinions for genuine understanding. We collect facts, form judgments, and defend positions without ever examining whether our fundamental assumptions are sound. Plato distinguished between episteme, knowledge, and doxa, opinion. Opinion is based on appearances and changes as circumstances change. Knowledge is based on unchanging reality and remains stable regardless of shifting conditions. The philosopher's turn involves learning to distinguish between these two modes of understanding and gradually orienting yourself toward genuine knowledge rather than mere opinion. This distinction has profound implications for how you navigate conflicting viewpoints, make important decisions, and maintain your equilibrium in a polarized world. Instead of getting caught up in the endless debate about opinions, you learn to look for the underlying principles that remain constant beneath changing perspectives. Consider how this applies to political discourse. Instead of getting trapped in arguments about particular policies or personalities, the philosophical mind asks deeper questions. What principles of justice, freedom, and human flourishing should guide our collective decisions? How we distinguish between policies that serve genuine human needs and those that merely serve partisan interests. What unchanging values should inform our changing strategies. This approach doesn't make you politically inactive or indifferent to social issues. Instead, it provides a stable foundation for engaging with temporal concerns without being overwhelmed by their emotional charge. You can care deeply about outcomes while maintaining your center. Work passionately for change while accepting that you can't control results. The philosopher's turn ultimately leads to what Plato called the ascent of the soul, a gradual movement from confusion to clarity, from illusion to reality, from restlessness to serenity. But this ascent isn't a one-time achievement. It's an ongoing process of remembering and forgetting, seeing clearly and getting caught up in appearances again, touching eternal truth, and then losing sight of it in the midst of daily concerns. The key is developing what might be called philosophical vigilance, the capacity to catch yourself when you're mistaking shadow for reality and to gently redirect your attention toward what's actually true. This vigilance isn't harsh self-judgment. It's the kind of loving awareness that a good teacher brings to a confused student. Your restless mind, your chronic dissatisfaction, your sense that something fundamental is missing. These aren't personal failings that need to be eliminated. They're invitations to make the philosopher's turn, to question the assumptions that have been organized in your life, to discover the unchanging reality that exists beneath all changing appearances. The serenity you seek isn't found by acquiring better shadows or arranging temporary circumstances more skillfully. It's discovered by recognizing the eternal light that makes all seeing possible, the unchanging ground of being that you are beneath all the changing roles you play. In our next exploration, we'll see how this Platonic foundation prepares us for the Stoic discipline, learning not just to see reality clearly, but to align our will completely with what we discover there. The philosopher who has turned toward the light of truth is ready for the next stage of the journey, accepting reality so completely that resistance becomes impossible and peace becomes inevitable. A Journey to Serenity, Part 4, Marcus Aurelius and his tent, Stoic Serenity Under Pressure. Picture this scene. It's 170 AD, somewhere along the Danube frontier. Outside, barbarian tribes threaten the borders of the Roman Empire. Inside the command tent, plague has decimated the legions, supplies are running low, and political intrigue back in Rome threatens the stability of the realm. The weight of an entire civilization rests on one man's shoulders. That man is Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, the most powerful person in the known world. And what is he doing in the midst of this chaos? He's writing in his personal journal by candlelight, recording thoughts that will become one of humanity's greatest guides to inner peace. These private reflections, never intended for publication, reveal something extraordinary: how to maintain perfect serenity while bearing crushing responsibility. Very little is needed to make a happy life, he writes. It is all within yourself in your way of thinking. This wasn't abstract philosophy from Marcus Aurelius. This was survival wisdom, forged in the crucible of impossible circumstances. While lesser men might have been consumed by anxiety, rage, or despair, the philosopher-emperor had discovered something that made him virtually unshakable: the fundamental distinction between what you can control and what you cannot control. This distinction is the cornerstone of Stoic philosophy, and it's the most practical tool for achieving serenity that has ever been devised. It sounds simple, almost too simple. But when you truly understand and apply this principle, it transforms everything about how you experience life. Let's start with what Marcus Aurelius could not control: the plague ravaging his army, the barbarian invasions threatening his borders, the political conspiracies brewing the capital, the inevitable decay of his aging body, and ultimately his own death. These were massive, consequential realities that would have driven most people to distraction. Yet Marcus Aurelius remained serene because he had learned the first law of Stoic wisdom. You cannot control external events, but you can always control your response to them. What could he control? His thoughts about the situation, his emotional reactions to setbacks, his decisions about how to allocate his energy, his treatment of subordinates and enemies alike, and most importantly, his commitment to virtue regardless of outcomes. These internal realities were completely within his power, and by focusing exclusively on what he could control, he found an unshakable foundation for peace. Consider how radical this approach is in our current culture. We're taught to believe that our happiness depends on managing external circumstances, getting the right job, finding the right relationship, living in the right place, having the right amount of money. We spend enormous energy trying to control things that are fundamentally beyond our control, then wonder why we feel constantly anxious and frustrated. Jennifer, a successful project manager, learned this lesson during what she initially thought was the worst period of her career. She had been leading a critical initiative for her company when everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Key team members quit unexpectedly. The primary vendor failed to deliver crucial components, and budget cuts forced major changes to the project's scope. For weeks, Jennifer barely slept, working 18-hour days trying to control every variable and force the project back on track. The breakthrough came when she found herself having what she called her Marcus Aurelius moment. During a particularly brutal all-nighter, exhausted and overwhelmed, she stopped trying to manage every detail and asked herself a simple question: what aspect of the situation can I actually control? The answer was simultaneously humbling and liberating. She couldn't control her team members' personal decisions to leave the company. She couldn't control the vendor's supply chain failures. She couldn't control the executive team's budget decisions. But she could control her own effort, her communication with stakeholders, her treatment of remaining team members, and most importantly, her internal response to circumstances beyond her influence. Once Jennifer made this distinction clearly, everything changed. Instead of exhausting herself trying to manage the unmanageable, she poured all her energy into what was actually within her power. She communicated honestly with leadership about realistic timelines given constraints. She focused on supporting her remaining team members rather than resenting those who had left. She developed contingency plans based on what resources were actually available rather than what she wished she had. The project still faced significant challenges, but Jennifer's relationship to those challenges was completely transformed. She had discovered what Marcus Aurelius knew. Serenity doesn't come from having favorable circumstances. It comes from accepting whatever circumstances arise while maintaining complete responsibility for your response to them. This principle extends far beyond professional challenges. Consider how it applies to one of the most common sources of suffering in modern life: other people's behavior. How much energy do you waste trying to change your spouse, fix your children, convince your parents, or control your friends? How often do you make your peace conditional on other people acting the way you think they should? Marcus Aurelius faced this challenge on an imperial scale. He had to work with senators who opposed him, generals who might betray him, and citizens who didn't always appreciate his leadership. He could have spent his reign in constant frustration, trying to force others to see things his way. Instead, he applied Stoic principles to human relationships with remarkable results. Whenever you want to cheer yourself, he wrote, consider the good qualities of your companions. This wasn't naive optimism. It was strategic wisdom. Marcus Aurelius understood that you can't control other people's character, but you can control what aspects of their character you choose to focus on. You can't make someone love you, but you can choose to love them regardless of their response. You can't force someone to be grateful, but you can choose to be generous without expecting gratitude. This approach to relationships is initially challenging for most people because it requires giving up one of our most cherished illusions: the belief that we can control others through the right combination of persuasion, manipulation, or force. When you truly accept that other people's thoughts, feelings, and choices are beyond your control, you stop wasting energy on impossible tasks and start focusing on what's actually achievable. Sarah, dealing with her aging mother's increasing dementia, discovered this principle during one of the most difficult periods of her life. Her mother, once articulate and independent, was becoming confused, sometimes aggressive, and increasingly unable to recognize family members. Sarah's initial response was to fight the disease, constantly correcting her mother's misconceptions, arguing with doctors, and exhausting herself trying to prevent every possible decline. Her stoic awakening came during a particularly difficult visit when her mother didn't recognize her and became frightened, thinking Sarah was a stranger trying to harm her. In that moment, Sarah realized she had been trying to control something completely beyond her power: the progression of her mother's illness and her mother's experience of reality. Once Sarah accepted what she couldn't control, the disease itself, her mother's cognitive decline, or her mother's day-to-day emotional state, she could focus completely on what she could control: her own presence, patience, and love. Instead of fighting her mother's new reality, she learned to meet her there. Instead of correcting every confusion, she focused on providing comfort and connection within whatever reality her mother was experiencing. This shift didn't cure her mother's dementia, but it transformed Sarah's experience of caring for her. She stopped measuring success by her mother's cognitive improvement and started measuring it by her own capacity for unconditional love. She discovered what Marcus Aurelius taught. When you align your will with reality instead of demanding that reality conform to your will, you find peace even in the most challenging circumstances. The Stoic approach to control extends to perhaps the most fundamental challenge of human existence, our own mortality. Marcus Aurelius was acutely aware that death could come at any moment, through assassination, disease, or the hazards of military campaigns. Rather than living in denial or anxiety about this ultimate uncertainty, he used the reality of death as a tool for achieving greater serenity. "It never ceases to amaze me," he wrote. "We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinion than our own." This observation reveals how much energy we waste worrying about things that ultimately don't matter. We exhaust ourselves seeking approval from people whose opinions will be forgotten, accumulating possessions that will outlast us by only a few years, and building identities that will dissolve when we're gone. When you truly accept your own mortality, not as a morbid fixation, but as a simple fact that clarifies priorities, it becomes much easier to distinguish between what deserves your attention and what doesn't. The colleague who doesn't appreciate your work, the neighbor who plays music too loudly, the politician whose views you find offensive. These concerns shrink to their proper size when viewed from the perspective of ultimate reality. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent or withdrawn from life. Marcus Aurelius remained deeply engaged with his responsibilities as emperor while maintaining perspective that comes from accepting impermanence. He cared about the welfare of his subjects without making his peace dependent on their gratitude. He worked to improve conditions in the empire without demanding that his efforts produce perfect results. The Stoic practice of memento mori, remembering death, isn't designed to make you depressed or fearful. It's designed to free you from the tyranny of trivial concerns and connect you with what truly matters. When you remember that your time is limited, you become more generous with love, more patient with difficulties, and more appreciative of simple pleasures. Michael, facing a cancer diagnosis at 52, discovered this truth in a way he never expected. Initially, the diagnosis filled him with rage and terror. He felt cheated, angry at the unfairness of serious illness, striking someone who had tried to live responsibly. But as the shock wore off, something unexpected happened. Clarity. The diagnosis forced Michael to confront what he could and couldn't control in the starkest possible terms. He couldn't control the fact that he had cancer or guarantee that treatment would be successful, but he could control how he spent whatever time remained, how he related to his family during this crisis, and what kind of person he chose to be in the face of ultimate uncertainty. This acceptance didn't make Michael passive about his treatment. He researched options, sought second opinions, and followed his oncologist's recommendations diligently. But he stopped wasting energy on anger about having the disease or anxiety about outcomes he couldn't guarantee. Instead, he focused on what was actually within his power, being fully present with loved ones, expressing gratitude for experiences he had previously taken for granted, and maintaining his integrity regardless of what the future held. The result was unexpected. Michael found a quality of peace and joy during his illness that had often eluded him during periods of perfect health. He had discovered what Marcus Aurelius knew. Serenity comes not from having favorable circumstances, but from accepting whatever circumstances arise while maintaining complete responsibility for your inner response. This Stoic approach to control also applies to one of the most common sources of modern anxiety, the gap between expectations and reality. We create detailed mental pictures of how we want our lives to unfold, then suffer when reality inevitably differs from our projections. We expect our careers to progress smoothly, our relationships to be consistently harmonious, our health to remain stable, and our children to make choices we approve of. Marcus Aurelius understood that expectations are just another form of trying to control the uncontrollable. Confine yourself to the present, he advised. This wasn't about becoming short-sighted or failing to plan for the future. It was about recognizing that your peace of mind depends on accepting what's actually happening rather than demanding that what's happening match your preferences. The emperor faced this challenge constantly. His military campaigns rarely unfolded according to plan. Political situations evolved in unexpected directions. Personal relationships disappointed him. But instead of making his serenity conditional on reality matching his expectations, he learned to find peace within whatever reality presented itself. This doesn't mean becoming a passive victim of circumstances or abandoning all preferences and goals. Marcus Aurelius worked tirelessly to defend the empire and improve conditions for his subjects. But he held his goals lightly, pursuing them with full effort while remaining unattached to specific outcomes. The practical application of this principle is transformative. Instead of saying, "I'll be happy when I get the promotion," you learn to say, "I'll work toward the promotion while finding happiness in the present circumstances." Instead of, "I'll feel secure when I have more money in savings," you recognize, "I'll save responsibly while learning to feel secure with what I have now." This shift from conditional to unconditional well-being is at the heart of Stoic serenity. It's not that external circumstances don't matter. It's that your fundamental peace doesn't depend on them. You can prefer health to illness, success to failure, harmony to conflict, while maintaining your equanimity regardless of which alternative manifests. Marcus Aurelius demonstrated this principle during the final years of his life. The military campaigns were largely successful, but the costs were enormous. The plague had killed millions throughout the empire. Political stability remained fragile. His own health was failing. By any external measure, his reign was ending with mixed results at best. Yet his final journal entries reveal someone who had achieved what might be called perfect contentment. He had learned to measure success not by external outcomes, but by internal integrity. He had done his duty as emperor, maintained his commitment to virtue, and accepted the results with complete equanimity. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, he wrote, "Tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being." This simple practice reveals the essence of Stoic wisdom, finding purpose and meaning in the mere fact of being alive and conscious, regardless of what particular circumstances you face. Your restless mind, your chronic anxiety about the future, your frustration with people and situations you can't control. These aren't personal failings that need to be eliminated through better circumstances. They're invitations to make the fundamental distinction that brought serenity to the most powerful and pressured man in the ancient world. The peace you seek isn't waiting in some future arrangement of external circumstances. It's available right now, in this moment, through the simple but revolutionary act of taking complete responsibility for what you can control while accepting everything else with grace. In our next exploration, we'll discover how another Stoic philosopher took this principle even further, finding freedom in the most constraining circumstances imaginable and teaching us that true liberty has nothing to do with external conditions. A Journey to Serenity, Part 5, Epicurus Chains, Freedom Through Discipline. Imagine being born into slavery in the Roman Empire. Your body belongs to another human being who can buy, sell, beat, or even kill you without legal consequence. Your time, your energy, your very life are not your own. You have no rights, no property, no protection under the law. You are, by every external measure, the least free person in society. Now imagine that this slave becomes one of the freest human beings who ever lived. Not free in body. Those chains are never broken. But free in mind, spirit, and soul in a way that his masters could never touch. This was Epicurus, and his story reveals the most paradoxical truth about human liberation. True freedom has nothing to do with external circumstances and everything to do with internal discipline. No one can hurt you without your permission, Epicurus taught. This wasn't wishful thinking from someone who had never experienced real hardship. This was hard-won wisdom from a man who understood constraint more intimately than almost anyone in history. He had discovered something that even the emperors who owned him never learned, that your mind is the only territory you can completely control, and therefore the only place where genuine freedom is possible. Epicurus was born around 50 AD in Hierapolis, in what is now Turkey. While still young, he was enslaved and brought to Rome, where he served in the household of Epaphroditus, a powerful freedman who served Emperor Nero. According to historical accounts, Epictetus walked with a limp for the rest of his life, possibly due to mistreatment during his slavery, though he himself never complained about this or used it to justify bitterness or resentment. What's remarkable is not that Epictetus survived slavery, many did, but that he emerged from it with a philosophy of such profound joy and unshakable inner peace that it would inspire seekers of wisdom for 2 millennia. While his body remained in chains, his mind achieved a liberation so complete that he could teach others what freedom actually means. The key to Epictetus' transformation lies in understanding what he meant by discipline. In our culture, discipline often carries negative connotations: restriction, punishment, the suppression of natural desires. But for Epictetus, discipline was the pathway to ultimate liberation. He identified 3 fundamental disciplines that, when mastered, create unassailable inner freedom: the discipline of desire, the discipline of action, and the discipline of assent. The discipline of desire is learning to want what happens rather than demanding that what you want must happen. This sounds passive, even fatalistic, until you understand what Epictetus actually meant. He wasn't advocating for the elimination of all preferences or the surrender of all goals. He was teaching a specific mental skill: the ability to hold your desires lightly enough that your peace doesn't depend on their fulfillment. Consider Maria, a mother whose teenage son struggled with addiction. For years, she exhausted herself trying to control his choices, monitoring his activities, managing his consequences, and making her own happiness entirely dependent on his recovery. Every relapse sent her into despair. Every period of sobriety filled her with hope that was inevitably crushed by the next setback. Maria's breakthrough came when she encountered Epictetus' teaching about desire. She realized she had been demanding that reality conform to her will, that her son choose sobriety, that addiction be conquered through her vigilance, that her love be powerful enough to save him. But these demands were causing her to suffer continuously, and paradoxically, her suffering was making it harder for her to be genuinely helpful to her son. Applying the discipline of desire didn't mean Maria stopped caring about her son's recovery or ceased trying to help him. Instead, she learned to hold her desire for his healing in a way that didn't make her peace conditional on its fulfillment. She could prefer his sobriety while finding serenity regardless of his choices. She could offer support while accepting that the outcome was beyond her control. This shift transformed both Maria's inner experience and her ability to genuinely help her son. When she stopped making his recovery the condition for her own well-being, she became a source of stable love rather than anxious pressure. She could respond to his needs from clarity rather than desperation. She discovered what Epictetus taught: when you stop demanding that circumstances be different, you become much more effective at working within whatever circumstances actually exist. The discipline of desire also applies to our relationship with success and failure, pleasure and pain, praise and criticism. Epictetus understood that the emotional charge we give to external events is what enslaves us to them. The promotion isn't inherently good or bad. It's your attachment to getting it that creates suffering when it doesn't come. The criticism isn't inherently harmful. It's your resistance to hearing it that generates internal turmoil. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to outcomes or ceasing to have preferences. Epictetus himself had strong preferences. He preferred teaching to remaining silent, preferred virtue to vice, preferred helping others to selfishness. But he had learned to pursue these preferences without making his peace dependent on achieving them. The second discipline, the discipline of action, involves learning to act from virtue rather than from the desire for specific results. In our outcome-obsessed culture, this represents a radical reorientation of how we think about effectiveness and success. James, a sales manager, discovered this principle during a particularly challenging quarter. His team was consistently missing targets despite his best efforts. He had tried different strategies, provided additional training, offered various incentives, and worked longer hours than ever before. Yet the numbers continued to disappoint, and James found himself becoming increasingly frustrated and demoralized. His transformation came when he shifted from focusing on results he couldn't guarantee to focusing on actions that were completely within his control. Instead of measuring his success by his team sales numbers, he began measuring it by the quality of his leadership, the integrity of his communication, and the consistency of his effort. James started focusing on whether he was providing clear direction, honest feedback, and genuine support to his team members. He concentrated on whether he was modeling the behavior he wanted to see, maintaining his own morale during difficult periods, and treating both success and failure as learning opportunities. The paradoxical result was that when James stopped making his worth as a leader dependent on sales results, his leadership actually became more effective. His team responded better to a manager who remained calm under pressure than to one who was anxious about outcomes. His own performance improved when he focused on process rather than results. This is what Epictetus meant by the discipline of action. Doing what is right because it is right, not because of what it might produce. When your actions flow from virtue rather than from attachment to outcomes, you become simultaneously more peaceful and more effective. The third discipline, the discipline of assent, is perhaps the most subtle but also the most powerful. It involves learning to examine your thoughts before accepting them as true. Epictetus understood that we suffer not because of what happens to us, but because of what we tell ourselves about what happens to us. It's not things that upset us, he taught, but our judgment about things. This insight predates modern cognitive therapy by nearly 2,000 years, but identifies the same fundamental mechanism. Our emotional responses are not automatic reactions to external events, but are mediated by our interpretations of those events. Consider the difference between these two interpretations of the same event. Losing a job. Interpretation A: this is terrible. I'm a failure. My career is ruined. I'll never find anything as good. My family will suffer because of my incompetence. Interpretation B: this is challenging and unexpected. It's an opportunity to reassess my career direction, develop new skills, and possibly find work that's more aligned with my values. Many successful people have faced similar setbacks and emerged stronger. The external facts are identical in both cases, but the internal experience is completely different. The discipline of assent involves learning to catch yourself in the act of interpretation and choosing thoughts that serve your well-being rather than undermine it. This isn't about positive thinking or self-deception. It's about accuracy. The first interpretation contains several unexamined assumptions that may not be true, that this job loss defines your worth, that your career trajectory is permanently damaged, that you won't find better opportunities. The second interpretation is actually more realistic because it acknowledges both the challenge and the possibilities inherent in the situation. Rachel, dealing with her husband's cancer diagnosis, learned this discipline during one of the most frightening periods of her life. Her initial mental response was catastrophic. He's going to die. I'll be alone. Our children will grow up without their father. Life will never be good again. The discipline of assent helped Rachel recognize that these thoughts, while understandable, were interpretations rather than facts. The fact was that her husband had received a cancer diagnosis and would need treatment. Her catastrophic projections about the future were mental additions that increased her suffering without helping anyone. Learning to practice assent didn't mean Rachel became unrealistically optimistic about her husband's condition. Instead, she learned to stay present with what was actually happening rather than suffering in advance for futures that might never occur. She could acknowledge the seriousness of the diagnosis while refusing to accept her mind's worst-case scenarios as inevitable realities. This mental discipline allowed Rachel to be genuinely helpful during her husband's treatment. Instead of being overwhelmed by imagined futures, she could focus on what was needed in each present moment. She could provide emotional support without adding her own anxiety to an already difficult situation. The three disciplines work together to create what Epictetus called the citadel of the self, an inner sanctuary that remains untouchable regardless of external circumstances. This citadel isn't built through wishful thinking or denial of reality. It's constructed through the daily practice of distinguishing between what you can and cannot control, acting from virtue rather than attachment to outcomes, and examining your thoughts before accepting them as truth. The paradox that Epictetus discovered, and that made him freer than his masters, is that discipline creates liberty rather than restricting it. When you discipline your desires, you stop being enslaved by outcomes beyond your control. When you discipline your actions, you stop being manipulated by the promise of external rewards or the fear of external punishments. When you discipline your thoughts, you stop being the victim of your own mental habits. This kind of freedom is available regardless of your external circumstances. Epictetus taught from a position of physical slavery and proved that inner liberation doesn't depend on external liberation. But this principle applies equally to the more subtle forms of bondage that affect us today. You might not be physically enslaved, but consider how many invisible chains constrain your peace of mind. You're chained to your phone, constantly checking for messages and updates. You're chained to other people's opinions, making your self-worth dependent on their approval. You're chained to your past mistakes, unable to move forward because you can't forgive yourself. You're chained to your future anxieties, unable to enjoy the present because you're worried about what might go wrong. These chains are more subtle than Epictetus' physical bondage, but they're often just as restricting. The good news is that the same principles that liberated his mind can liberate yours. The disciplines he developed in slavery can be practiced in freedom to create even greater freedom. Take the modern obsession with social media validation. How much of your emotional state depends on likes, comments, shares, and followers? How often do you craft posts not to express authentic thoughts, but to generate positive responses? How frequently do you check your phone, hoping for digital validation but feeling empty when it doesn't come? The discipline of desire would involve holding your preference for positive social media feedback lightly enough that your peace doesn't depend on receiving it. The discipline of action would mean posting from authenticity rather than from a need for validation. The discipline of assent would involve questioning the thoughts that tell you that digital approval equals real worth. Or consider the anxiety many people feel about their careers. How much energy do you waste worrying about promotions you can't guarantee, economic conditions you can't control, or technological changes that might affect your industry? How often do you make your sense of security depend on external factors that are inherently uncertain? Applying Epictetus disciplines to career anxiety would mean pursuing professional goals without making your peace conditional on achieving them, performing your work with integrity regardless of whether that integrity is rewarded, and examining the thoughts that create unnecessary suffering about future possibilities you can't control. The liberation that Epictetus achieved isn't just historical inspiration. It's a practical template for finding freedom within whatever constraints you face. His physical chains were eventually broken when he was freed after Nero's death, but by then, he had already achieved a more profound liberation that no external circumstance could touch. After gaining his freedom, Epictetus established a school of philosophy where he taught others the principles that had sustained him through slavery. His students came from all backgrounds: slaves and senators, merchants and soldiers, people facing every conceivable form of external constraint. But they all learned the same fundamental truth, that genuine freedom is always available because it's always internal. The disciplines that Epictetus taught aren't comfortable or easy. They require the willingness to question thoughts you've never examined, to release attachments you considered essential, and to find meaning in virtue rather than in outcomes. But they offer something that no external achievement can provide: unshakable inner peace that doesn't depend on favorable circumstances. Your restless mind, your chronic worry about things beyond your control, your emotional dependence on external validation, these aren't permanent features of your personality. They're simply habits of thought and feeling that can be changed through the same disciplined practice that transformed a Roman slave into one of history's greatest teachers of freedom. The chains that bind you aren't visible, but they're real. The good news is that the key to unlocking them is completely within your reach. It's been there all along, waiting for you to develop the discipline to use it. In our next exploration, we'll see how another Stoic philosopher applied these principles to the challenge of enjoying worldly success without being enslaved by it, learning to hold wealth lightly and engage fully with life while maintaining perfect inner detachment. A Journey to Serenity, Part 6. Seneca's Wealth, Enjoying Without Attachment. Lucius Annaeus Seneca was one of the richest men in Rome. He owned vast estates, commanded enormous influence as advisor to Emperor Nero, and accumulated wealth that would make him a billionaire by today's standards. He enjoyed fine wine, gourmet food, luxurious accommodations, and all the pleasures that money could buy. He was also one of history's greatest teachers of detachment and inner peace. This seems like a contradiction until you understand what Seneca discovered about the relationship between external abundance and internal serenity. His life answered a question that torments many people. Is it possible to enjoy worldly success while maintaining spiritual freedom? Can you have wealth without being possessed by it? Can you engage fully with material life while keeping your peace independent of material circumstances? Seneca's answer was revolutionary. Not only is it possible to enjoy prosperity while remaining detached from it, but this combination actually enhances both your effectiveness in the world and your capacity for genuine happiness. The key lies in understanding the difference between having things and being owned by things, between enjoying circumstances and depending on them for your well-being. It is not the man who is too little, but the man who craves more, who is poor, Seneca wrote. This insight cuts to the heart of human psychology. Poverty and wealth aren't primarily about external circumstances. They're about internal relationship to whatever circumstances you have. You can be materially rich but spiritually impoverished if your peace depends on maintaining or increasing your wealth. Conversely, you can have relatively little but feel genuinely abundant if you're content with what you possess. Consider David, a successful entrepreneur who built a technology company from nothing into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. For years, each new milestone brought temporary satisfaction, followed quickly by the next goal, the next acquisition, the next level to achieve. Despite his obvious success, David found himself constantly anxious about competitors, obsessed with market conditions, and unable to enjoy his achievements because he was always focused on what might go wrong. The turning point came when David encountered Seneca's writings during a particularly stressful period when his company faced potential acquisition offers. Instead of feeling excited about the financial windfall, David felt paralyzed by the decision. He realized he'd become so identified with his business success that he couldn't imagine who he would be without it. Seneca's approach to wealth taught David a different way of relating to his achievements. Instead of deriving his identity from his net worth, he learned to see his wealth as a tool that could serve various purposes but wasn't essential to his fundamental well-being. This shift didn't make him careless about business decisions, but it freed him from the anxiety that had been consuming him. When David eventually sold his company, he discovered that his peace remained stable regardless of whether the numbers in his bank account increased or decreased. He had learned what Seneca taught. External abundance is most enjoyable when you don't need it for your happiness. But Seneca's wisdom extends far beyond financial wealth. The same principles apply to any external good that enhances life, but shouldn't define it. Health, relationships, reputation, career success, creative achievements, or social status. The key is learning what Seneca called the proper use of indifferent things, engaging fully with external goods while maintaining inner independence from them. Seneca practiced this principle through what might seem like a contradictory lifestyle. He lived luxuriously but regularly practiced voluntary poverty, spending periods sleeping on the floor, eating simple food, and wearing basic clothing. He wasn't punishing himself or rejecting material pleasures. He was training his mind to remain content regardless of circumstances. Set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, "Is this the condition that I feared?" This wasn't masochism, but practical wisdom. By voluntarily experiencing discomfort, Seneca maintained his capacity to find peace in any situation. He never became so dependent on luxury that its absence would disturb his tranquility. This practice of voluntary discomfort serves several purposes. First, it breaks the psychological habituation that makes us take our blessings for granted. When you spend a night sleeping on a hard floor, your comfortable bed feels like a luxury rather than a necessity. When you've eaten simple food for several days, an ordinary meal tastes extraordinary. Voluntary discomfort resets your baseline for appreciation. Second, it builds confidence in your ability to be content with less. Much of our anxiety about losing what we have stems from unconscious doubt about our capacity to be happy with simpler circumstances. By periodically choosing simplicity, you prove to yourself that your well-being doesn't depend on maintaining your current level of external comfort. Lisa, a marketing executive, discovered this principle when she decided to take Seneca's advice literally. Despite living in an expensive apartment and earning a substantial salary, she spent one weekend each month living as if she had very little money. She would eat basic foods, avoid entertainment expenses, and sleep on her couch instead of her bed. Initially, these experiments felt artificial and uncomfortable, but over time, Lisa noticed something unexpected. She began appreciating her normal lifestyle more deeply, while simultaneously feeling less anxious about potentially losing it. She realized that many of her work-related anxieties stemmed from unconscious fear that she couldn't be happy with less money or lower status. The voluntary discomfort didn't make Lisa ascetic or unambitious. Instead, it freed her to pursue professional goals from genuine interest rather than from fear of scarcity. She could negotiate more effectively because she wasn't desperate to maintain her current lifestyle. She could take creative risks because she knew she could be content even if they didn't pay off financially. Seneca understood that attachment, not enjoyment, is what creates suffering. You can thoroughly enjoy a beautiful meal while remaining unattached to having gourmet food every day. You can appreciate a loving relationship while not making your happiness depend on that person never changing. You can take pleasure in professional success while maintaining your sense of worth independently of career outcomes. This distinction between enjoyment and attachment is crucial for understanding how to live fully without being enslaved by your circumstances. Attachment involves emotional dependency, the belief that you need specific external conditions to be fundamentally okay. Enjoyment involves appreciation without dependency, the ability to receive life's pleasures gratefully while remaining centered in yourself. Consider how this applies to one of the most challenging areas for practicing non-attachment: romantic relationships. Our culture teaches us to seek completion through partnership, to find our other half, to merge so completely with another person that we can't imagine being happy alone. This romantic attachment creates enormous suffering when relationships change, as they inevitably do. Seneca's approach to love was radically different. He loved deeply but held his beloved lightly. He appreciated his wife's companionship without making it necessary for his contentment. He could enjoy the pleasures of partnership while maintaining his capacity for solitude. This didn't make him cold or distant. It made him capable of loving from abundance rather than need. Marcus, recently divorced after a 20-year marriage, initially experienced Seneca's teachings as almost insulting. Easy to talk about non-attachment, he thought, when you haven't just lost the person you plan to spend your life with. But as his initial grief evolved into deeper reflection, Marcus began to understand what Seneca meant. The problem wasn't that Marcus had loved his wife. The problem was that he had made her responsible for his happiness. He had organized his entire sense of identity around being her husband, his social life around their coupledom, his future plans around their shared dreams. When the marriage ended, he felt like he had lost himself, not just his partner. Learning to love without attachment didn't mean Marcus became emotionally guarded in future relationships. Instead, he learned to bring wholeness to his partnerships rather than seeking completion through them. He could appreciate a partner's unique qualities without needing them to fill internal voids. He could commit to shared goals while maintaining his individual center. This shift made Marcus more attractive as a partner, not less. People are drawn to those who love from abundance rather than need, who can offer genuine presence rather than emotional dependency. When you're complete in yourself, you can truly see and appreciate another person rather than unconsciously using them to meet your own psychological needs. Seneca's wisdom also applies to the modern challenge of career identity. In our achievement-oriented culture, many people derive their entire sense of worth from professional success. They introduce themselves by their job titles, measure their value by their salaries, and experience existential crisis during periods of unemployment or career transition. This occupational attachment creates tremendous suffering because careers are inherently uncertain. Industries change, companies restructure, skills become obsolete, health issues arise, and retirement eventually arrives. If your fundamental identity depends on your professional role, these inevitable transitions become threats to your very sense of self. Jennifer, a senior lawyer at a prestigious firm, discovered this when she was diagnosed with a chronic illness that forced her to reduce her work schedule significantly. For years, her identity had been completely wrapped up in being known as someone who worked longer hours, handled more cases, and achieved better results than her colleagues. The illness forced Jennifer to confront who she was when she wasn't performing at maximum professional capacity. Initially, this was terrifying. She felt like she was disappearing as her work role diminished. But gradually, she began to discover aspects of herself that had been overshadowed by career obsession. Applying Seneca's principles, Jennifer learned to appreciate her legal skills while not making them essential to her self-worth. She could take pride in professional achievements while maintaining her sense of value independently of career outcomes. She began to see her work as one expression of her capabilities rather than as the sole source of her identity. This shift made Jennifer more effective as a lawyer, not less. When you're not desperately attached to outcomes, you can think more clearly, take appropriate risks, and serve clients from genuine care rather than from need to prove your worth. She found that clients responded better to an attorney who was confident and centered rather than anxious and identity-dependent. Seneca also understood the challenge of dealing with loss, which is inevitable when you engage fully with life while maintaining non-attachment. He experienced significant losses himself: political exile, financial setbacks, the deaths of loved ones, and ultimately his own forced suicide on Nero's orders. His teachings about grief and loss are among the most practical wisdom ever recorded about how to navigate life's inevitable difficulties. What is grief but an opinion? Seneca wrote, "This seems harsh until you understand what he meant. Grief is a natural emotional response to loss, and Seneca never suggested suppressing or denying these feelings. But much of what we call grief is actually mental elaboration on the basic fact of loss. Stories about how unfair life is, projections about how terrible the future will be, or self-blame about what we could have done differently. The basic fact that someone you love has died, that a relationship has ended, that a hope for outcome didn't occur, is painful enough without adding layers of mental suffering on top of it. Seneca taught how to experience loss cleanly, without the additional torment that comes from resisting reality or creating elaborate narratives about what the loss means. This approach doesn't minimize the significance of losses or encourage emotional numbness. Instead, it allows you to grieve fully while maintaining your fundamental stability. You can feel sadness without being destroyed by it, experience disappointment without losing hope, face setbacks without questioning your fundamental worth. The practical application of Seneca's wisdom requires what might be called the discipline of gratitude. This isn't positive thinking or denial of difficulties. It's the systematic cultivation of appreciation for what you have while you have it, combined with acceptance that everything external is temporary. Seneca regularly contemplated losing his wealth, his health, his relationships, and his life itself. This wasn't morbid pessimism, but practical preparation. By mentally rehearsing loss, he developed a capacity to appreciate present blessings more fully while remaining resilient when circumstances changed. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end, Seneca observed. This insight reveals how acceptance of impermanence actually enhances rather than diminishes your capacity for joy. When you truly understand that everything external is temporary, you can appreciate present moments more fully because you're not taking them for granted. The wealthy Stoic's path offers a middle way between two extremes that both lead to suffering: the grasping pursuit of external goods as if they could provide ultimate satisfaction, and the rejection of external goods as if engaging with the world inevitably leads to attachment. Seneca showed that you can have wealth without being possessed by it, enjoy pleasures without being enslaved by them, and engage fully with life while maintaining perfect inner freedom. Your relationship to success, comfort, relationships, and achievements doesn't have to be either desperate attachment or indifferent withdrawal. There's a third option: grateful appreciation combined with inner independence. You can work toward goals while holding them lightly, love deeply while remaining centered in yourself, and enjoy life's pleasures while finding your peace independent of them. This balanced approach to external goods creates what Seneca called the happy life. Not happiness that comes and goes based on circumstances, but the stable contentment that emerges from knowing that your fundamental well-being doesn't depend on anything that can be taken away. In our next exploration, we'll see how the Stoic understanding of attachment and non-attachment prepared the ground for the Buddha's revolutionary insight into the nature of suffering itself, and the path to complete liberation from the mental habits that keep us trapped in cycles of dissatisfaction. A Journey to Serenity, Part 7. Buddha under the Bodhi tree, the Great Awakening. For 6 years, Siddhartha Gautama had subjected his body to extremes that would have killed most people. He ate so little that his ribs showed through his skin. He meditated for days without moving. He practiced austerities so severe that other ascetics considered him their spiritual superior. He was seeking the end of suffering through complete rejection of all worldly pleasure and comfort. But on the banks of the Naranja River, something remarkable happened. Exhausted and near death from his extreme practices, Siddhartha accepted a bowl of milk rice from a young woman named Sujata. As he consumed his first substantial meal in years, a profound realization dawned. Neither luxury nor deprivation would lead to the liberation he sought. Neither indulgence nor self-torture could free him from the fundamental dissatisfaction that pervades human existence. This moment of recognition led him to sit under what would become known as the Bodhi tree, where he made a simple but revolutionary vow: I will not rise from this spot until I have found the end of suffering. What happened during that night of meditation changed not only his life, but humanity's understanding of the mind, suffering, and the possibility of perfect peace. The man who sat under the tree was Prince Siddhartha, heir to a throne, raised in luxury but haunted by the reality of aging, illness, and death. The man who rose at dawn was a Buddha, literally the awakened one, who had discovered truths about suffering that would guide seekers for the next 2,500 years. What did he see during that transformative night? The Buddha later described his insight as the Four Noble Truths, but these weren't abstract philosophical concepts. They were precise diagnoses of the human condition based on direct observation of how the mind creates its own suffering and how that suffering can be ended completely. The first noble truth is the most difficult one for most people to accept. Life inherently involves suffering. The Pali word the Buddha used was dukkha, which encompasses everything from obvious pain to the subtle dissatisfaction that accompanies even pleasant experiences. Dukkha includes the suffering of birth, aging, illness, and death, but also includes the suffering of getting what you don't want and not getting what you do want. Most fundamentally, it includes the suffering that comes from the impermanent nature of all conditioned existence. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. The Buddha wasn't saying that life contains no joy, beauty, or meaningful experience. He was pointing out that even our happiest moments are tinged with the knowledge that they won't last, that our most satisfying achievements eventually lose their luster, and that our deepest relationships must end in separation through death, if not before. Consider Sarah, a successful architect who seemed to have everything she had worked for: a thriving practice, a loving family, financial security, and widespread recognition in her field. Yet she found herself waking up with a persistent sense that something was fundamentally wrong. Not wrong with her circumstances. Those were largely good, but wrong with the nature of existence itself. Her first encounter with the first noble truth came during what should have been a moment of triumph. She had just completed her most ambitious project, a cultural center that was being celebrated in architectural magazines worldwide. As she stood in the building on opening night, surrounded by praise and admiration, she felt a profound emptiness that she couldn't explain or rationalize away. Sarah initially tried to solve this feeling by pursuing new projects, traveling to exotic locations, and deepening her relationships. But the sense of fundamental dissatisfaction remained, sometimes dormant but always present, like a background note of discord in an otherwise harmonious life. The Buddha's insight helped Sarah understand that her experience wasn't a personal failing or a sign that something was wrong with her life. It was a natural result of trying to find permanent satisfaction in impermanent phenomena. Every achievement, no matter how significant, eventually becomes familiar. Every pleasure, no matter how intense, eventually fades. Every relationship, no matter how loving, involves a constant awareness that it could end. This recognition of dukkha isn't meant to make you depressed or cynical. It's meant to stop you from expecting the impossible and to redirect your search for fulfillment towards something that can actually provide it. The Buddha's first noble truth is like a doctor's accurate diagnosis, sometimes unwelcome but absolutely necessary for effective treatment. The second noble truth identifies the cause of this pervasive dissatisfaction, tanha, usually translated as craving or attachment. But the Buddha's understanding of craving goes much deeper than obvious addictions or desires. Craving, in the Buddhist sense, is the mind's compulsive tendency to grasp at experiences, to try and make permanent what is inherently impermanent, to seek completion through external phenomena. There are three types of craving that the Buddha identified. The first is craving for sensual pleasures, not just physical pleasures, but any experience that we hope will provide satisfaction to the senses. The second is craving for existence or becoming, the desire to be someone, to have an identity, to matter in the world. The third is craving for non-existence, the desire to escape, to not be bothered, to avoid the challenges and responsibilities of conscious existence. All three forms of craving share the same fundamental error. They assume that peace can be found by arranging external circumstances in particular ways. They're based on the illusion that if you could just get the right combination of experiences, achievements, relationships, and conditions, you would finally be content. Michael discovered this during a period of deep depression that followed the end of his marriage. Initially, he assumed his suffering was caused by the divorce itself, the loss of companionship, the disruption of his plans, the social awkwardness of being suddenly single in middle age. But as he worked with therapists familiar with Buddhist principles, he began to recognize deeper patterns. Michael realized he had been using his marriage to avoid facing fundamental questions about his own life. His identity as husband had provided a convenient way to avoid the more challenging work of discovering who he actually was. His daily routines with his wife had created a sense of purpose that masked his lack of deeper direction. Even the conflicts in his marriage had been preferable to the silence that forced him to confront his own thoughts and feelings. The end of the marriage wasn't the cause of his suffering. It was a removal of a distraction that had been covering up suffering that was already present. His pain wasn't really about losing his wife. It was about being forced to face the existential questions he had been avoiding through busyness, routine, and relationship drama. This recognition marked Michael's encounter with the second noble truth. His suffering wasn't being caused by external circumstances, but by his mind's habit of trying to use external circumstances to fill an internal void. He had been craving not just his wife's presence, but the identity, security, and sense of purpose that her presence seemed to provide. The third noble truth offers what might seem impossible: the complete cessation of suffering. Not the management of suffering, not the reduction of suffering, but the total end of the mental habits that create suffering in the first place. The Buddha called this state nirvana, which literally means extinction, not the extinction of life, but the extinction of the craving that causes suffering. This might sound abstract or even undesirable until you understand what the Buddha actually meant. Nirvana isn't a place you go or a permanent altered state of consciousness. It's the natural peace that emerges when you stop trying to use impermanent phenomena to provide permanent satisfaction. It's what remains when you cease the futile effort to complete yourself through external means. Lisa, a meditation teacher, experienced a taste of the cessation during what seemed like an ordinary afternoon. She had been practicing meditation for several years, primarily as a way to manage stress and improve her focus. But during one particular sitting, something shifted in a way she had never experienced before. The usual background anxiety that had accompanied her thoughts since childhood, the sense that she needed to be doing something else, going somewhere else, becoming someone else, simply wasn't there. She wasn't thinking about the past or planning for the future. She wasn't trying to improve her meditation or achieve any particular state. She was simply present, without the usual sense that presence needed to be different or enhanced in any way. The experience lasted only a few minutes, but it revealed something profound. Peace wasn't something she needed to create or acquire. It was something that was naturally present when she stopped trying to use her experience to get somewhere else. The contentment she had been seeking through achievements, relationships, and spiritual practices was already available whenever she stopped seeking it. This glimpse of cessation showed Lisa that the Buddha's third noble truth wasn't just theoretical. The end of suffering was possible because suffering was optional. It wasn't caused by life's inevitable challenges, but by the mind's habit of resisting what is while grasping for what isn't. The fourth noble truth provides a practical path to this cessation, the Noble Eightfold Path. This isn't a linear sequence of steps, but an integrated approach to living that gradually eliminates the mental habits that create suffering while cultivating the wisdom and compassion that flow naturally from a peaceful mind. The Eightfold Path consists of right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Each element supports and reinforces the others, creating a comprehensive training program for the mind that addresses every aspect of human experience. Right understanding involves seeing clearly into nature reality, recognizing the impermanence of all phenomena, the interconnectedness of all existence, and the optional nature of suffering. Right intention involves orienting your motivations toward liberation rather than toward the satisfaction of craving. Right speech, action, and livelihood involve aligning your external behavior with your inner commitment to ending suffering for yourself and others. Right effort involves a balanced energy that avoids both laziness and excessive striving. Right mindfulness involves maintaining clear awareness of what's actually happening in each moment without being lost in mental stories about what's happening. Right concentration involves developing the mental stability that makes deep insight possible. James, a business executive, began practicing the Eightfold Path after a stress-related health scare forced him to reconsider his lifestyle. Initially, he approached it like any other self-improvement program, expecting measurable results within a reasonable time frame. But he gradually discovered that the path worked in ways he hadn't expected. Instead of eliminating stress through better time management or improved circumstances, the practice began changing his relationship to stress itself. He started noticing how much of his anxiety came from mental resistance to present realities rather than from realities themselves. Board meetings were stressful not because they were inherently difficult, but because he spent them wishing they were different, worrying about outcomes he couldn't control, or comparing himself to colleagues. As James developed right mindfulness, he learned to attend meetings with full presence rather than mental commentary. He could engage completely with whatever was happening without the additional layer of judgment, resistance, or anxiety that had previously made simple situations exhausting. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic, but it was profound. James found himself less reactive to difficult people, more creative in solving problems, and more effective as a leader. Paradoxically, by caring less about specific outcomes, he became more capable of achieving positive results. But the Buddha's most radical insight wasn't just about individual liberation. He recognized that the same mental patterns that create personal suffering also create collective suffering. War, inequality, environmental destruction, and social conflict all arise from the same fundamental error of trying to find permanent satisfaction through impermanent means. When individuals stop trying to use external circumstances to fill internal voids, they become naturally generous, compassionate, and wise. They don't need to compete desperately for limited resources because they've discovered the unlimited resource of inner peace. They don't need to dominate others because they've found security within themselves. They don't need to consume excessively because they've learned the difference between wants and needs. This connection between personal liberation and social harmony wasn't just philosophical theory. For the Buddha, he spent 45 years teaching people from every background, kings and beggars, priests and outcasts, merchants and farmers, because he understood that awakening was both possible for everyone and beneficial for everyone. The community of practitioners that formed around his teachings demonstrated what becomes possible when people organize their lives around wisdom rather than craving. Instead of the usual human patterns of hierarchy, competition, and accumulation, the early Buddhist community was characterized by equality, cooperation, and voluntary simplicity. This doesn't mean that following the Buddha's path requires joining a monastery or rejecting worldly responsibilities. Many of his most accomplished students were householders who applied his teachings while maintaining careers, families, and active engagement with society. The key was learning to engage fully with life while holding all experiences lightly. The Buddha's awakening under the Bodhi tree revealed something that seems too good to be true, but is actually the most practical truth imaginable. Suffering is optional, not pain. That's inevitable in any human life. But the mental suffering we add to pain through resistance, judgment, and the futile attempt to make impermanent things permanent, that can be ended completely. Your restless mind, your chronic dissatisfaction, your sense that peace is always just out of reach. These aren't permanent features of human consciousness. They're learned habits that can be unlearned through the same kind of patient, systematic training that develops any skill. The Buddha proved that it's possible for a human being to be completely free from suffering while remaining fully engaged with life. His awakening wasn't a one-time mystical experience, but the result of understanding how the mind works and applying that understanding consistently until suffering was no longer possible. The serenity you seek isn't waiting in some future arrangement of circumstances. It's not hidden in the perfect relationship, the ideal career, or the ultimate achievement. It's available right now, in this moment, whenever you stop trying to use this moment to get somewhere else. In our next exploration, we'll discover how the Buddha's insight into the optional nature of suffering points toward what he called the middle way, a balanced approach to living that avoids both extreme indulgence and extreme deprivation while maintaining the perfect equilibrium that makes lasting peace possible. A Journey to Serenity, Part 8, The Middle Way, Neither Indulgence Nor Deprivation. The morning after his awakening, the Buddha faced a profound dilemma. He had discovered the end of suffering, found perfect peace, and understood the nature of reality with crystalline clarity. But how could he possibly communicate this discovery to others? How do you explain the indescribable? How do you teach what can only be directly experienced? Legend says that the Buddha initially hesitated to teach at all, convinced that his insights were too subtle for most people to understand. But compassion ultimately prevailed over doubt, and he began what would become 45 years of teaching, not through abstract philosophy, but through practical guidance that came to be known as the middle way. The middle way wasn't compromise or moderation in the ordinary sense. It was a precise understanding of how to navigate between the extreme errors that keep human beings trapped in cycles of suffering. The Buddha had discovered that liberation lies not in avoiding life or grasping it too tightly, but in engaging with it skillfully, fully present but not attached, caring deeply but not desperately, participating completely while remaining centered in peace. This might sound abstract until you examine how it applies to the most fundamental challenges of human existence. Take the question of pleasure, which has tormented philosophers and spiritual seekers for millennia. Should you pursue pleasure or renounce it? Enjoy it or transcend it? The Buddha's answer was revolutionary. Neither pursuit nor renunciation leads to freedom. The middle way involves experiencing pleasure without being controlled by it, and accepting pain without being destroyed by it. Consider Maria, a successful chef who had built her entire identity around the pursuit of culinary excellence. She spent her days creating extraordinary dining experiences, traveling to discover new flavors, and constantly seeking the perfect combination of taste, texture, and presentation. Food wasn't just a profession. It was her passion, her art, and her primary source of meaning. But Maria's relationship with food had become compulsive. She couldn't eat a simple meal without analyzing every aspect of its preparation. She couldn't enjoy restaurants without mentally critiquing their techniques. Even her own creations felt inadequate. There was always another level of perfection to achieve, another technique to master, another critic to impress. Her encounter with the middle way began during a period of professional burnout, when the joy had gone out of cooking entirely. She had reached the point where the pursuit of culinary perfection felt more like a prison than a passion. The very thing that had once brought her the greatest pleasure now felt like an obligation she couldn't escape. The middle way taught Maria neither to reject her love of food nor to be enslaved by it. She learned to cook with complete attention and genuine enjoyment while holding her creations lightly. She could pursue excellence without making her worth dependent on achieving it. She could appreciate extraordinary flavors without becoming addicted to constant stimulation. This transformation didn't make Maria less skilled as a chef. It made her more creative and effective. When she stopped trying to control the outcome of every dish and started simply offering her best effort with loving attention, her cooking became more inspired than when she had been desperately chasing perfection. The middle way applies equally to the other extreme, the rejection or denial of pleasure. Many spiritual traditions have taught that the path to liberation requires renouncing worldly enjoyment, suppressing desires, and treating the body as an obstacle to enlightenment. The Buddha had tried this approach during his 6 years of extreme asceticism, and he knew from direct experience that it didn't work. James discovered this during his own spiritual journey. Raised in a religious tradition that viewed pleasure with suspicion, he had spent years trying to transcend his desires through willpower and self-denial. He avoided entertainment, limited his social interactions, and generally treated any form of enjoyment as a spiritual failing. But this approach didn't bring the peace he was seeking. Instead, it created a different form of suffering. The constant internal battle against natural human impulses, the guilt when he occasionally enjoyed something, and the pride when he successfully denied himself pleasure. He was trapped in the opposite extreme from Maria's indulgence, but equally trapped nonetheless. The middle way showed James that the problem wasn't pleasure itself, but his relationship to pleasure. He could enjoy a beautiful sunset without becoming attached to having perfect weather every day. He could appreciate good food without making it the center of his existence. He could experience physical comfort without becoming so dependent on it that its absence would disturb his peace. This balanced approach to pleasure and pain is just one application of the middle way. The same principle applies to every aspect of human experience where we tend to swing between extremes: work and rest, solitude and companionship, thinking and feeling, planning and spontaneity, confidence and humility. Consider the modern challenge of work-life balance. Many people swing between two equally problematic extremes. Either they become workaholics who sacrifice everything for professional achievement, or they develop such a version of work that they can't find meaning in any career. The middle way offers a third option: engaging fully with work while maintaining perspective about its ultimate significance. David, a software engineer, struggled with this balance throughout his career. In his 20s, he had been completely consumed by his work, often coding for 16 hours a day and deriving his entire sense of identity from his programming skills. When burnout eventually forced him to reassess, he swung to the opposite extreme, viewing his career as nothing more than a necessary evil that funded his real life. Neither approach brought satisfaction. The workaholic phase left him exhausted and isolated, while the detached phase left him feeling meaningless and bored during the majority of his waking hours. The middle way taught David how to find a more sustainable relationship with his profession. He learned to engage fully with programming challenges while maintaining awareness that his work was one important aspect of his life, not the entirety of it. He could take pride in elegant solutions while accepting that no project will provide ultimate fulfillment. He could work diligently toward professional goals while finding his deepest contentment independent of career outcomes. This balanced approach made David more effective at work, not less. When he stopped desperately needing his project to provide meaning, he could approach them with the kind of relaxed focus that produces the best results. When he stopped fearing failure, he could take the creative risks that lead to breakthrough innovations. The middle way also applies to relationships, where people often swing between extremes of suffocating attachment and defensive isolation. On one side are those who lose themselves completely in relationships, making their happiness entirely dependent on their partner's moods, choices, and continued presence. On the other side are those who maintain such rigid independence that they never allow genuine intimacy or vulnerability. Sarah had experienced both extremes during different periods of her life. In her early relationships, she had been completely absorbed in her partners, constantly seeking reassurance, and feeling devastated when relationships ended. Later, after several painful breakups, she had swung to the opposite extreme, maintaining such emotional distance that her relationships felt safe but ultimately unsatisfying. The middle way taught Sarah how to love fully without losing herself, how to commit completely while accepting impermanence, and how to be vulnerable without becoming dependent. She learned to appreciate her partner's unique qualities while maintaining her own center, to work towards shared goals while remaining whole as an individual, and to grieve losses without being destroyed by them. This balanced approach to relationships didn't make Sarah less loving. It made her love more authentic and sustainable. When she stopped needing her partner to complete her, she could genuinely appreciate who they were rather than unconsciously trying to use them to fill her internal gaps. Perhaps the most challenging application of the middle way involves the relationship between effort and surrender, between striving for goals and accepting outcomes. Many people exhaust themselves through excessive effort, trying to force results through willpower and determination. Others become passive, concluding that since they can't control outcomes, there's no point in trying to influence them. The Buddha's middle way reveals that both extremes miss the mark. Right effort, one of the elements of the Noble Eightfold Path, involves neither desperate striving nor passive resignation. It's the balanced energy that comes from acting skillfully while remaining unattached to results, from caring deeply about your actions while holding lightly to their consequences. Lisa, an environmental activist, had struggled with this balance throughout her career. She cared passionately about climate change and had dedicated her life to promoting sustainable practices. But her activism had become desperate and anxious, driven by the fear that without her constant effort, environmental destruction would accelerate beyond any hope of reversal. This desperate effort was actually counterproductive. Lisa's anxiety made her less effective at communicating with people who didn't already share her concerns. Her attachment to specific outcomes made her inflexible when circumstances required adapting her strategies. Her sense of personal responsibility for solving global problems left her constantly exhausted and occasionally resentful. The middle way taught Lisa how to maintain passionate commitment while accepting that outcomes weren't entirely within her control. She could work tirelessly for environmental protection while finding peace independent of the results of her efforts. She could care deeply about the future of the planet while maintaining equanimity about humanity's ultimate choices. This transformation didn't make Lisa less committed to her cause. It made her more effective as an advocate. When she stopped needing to see immediate results from her efforts, she could work with the patience required for long-term change. When she released her desperate attachment to specific outcomes, she became more creative in developing strategies and more persuasive in presenting them. The middle way extends beyond individual psychology to social and political engagement. Here, too, people often swing between extremes, either becoming so identified with their ideological positions that they can't engage constructively with those who disagree, or becoming so detached from social issues that they contribute nothing to collective well-being. The Buddha's approach offers a third option: engage non-attachment. You can work passionately for social justice while maintaining compassion for those you oppose. You can hold strong convictions while remaining open to new information that might modify your views. You can care deeply about outcomes while finding your peace independent of political victories or defeats. This balanced approach to social engagement is desperately needed in our polarized world. When people are trapped in ideological extremes, they become incapable of the kind of genuine dialogue that could actually solve problems. The middle way creates space for a passionate commitment combined with intellectual humility, for strong action combined with compassionate understanding. The practical application of the middle way requires what might be called dynamic balance, the ability to respond appropriately to changing circumstances while maintaining your center. This isn't a static balance of trying to stay in the middle of every situation, but the fluid balance of a skilled dancer who can move in any direction while remaining grounded. Sometimes a middle way calls for more effort, sometimes for more acceptance. Sometimes it requires engaging more fully, sometimes stepping back for perspective. Sometimes it involves saying yes to new opportunities, sometimes saying no to preserve your energy. The key is developing the wisdom to recognize what each situation actually calls for rather than applying rigid formulas. This wisdom develops through what the Buddha called mindfulness, the clear awareness of what's actually happening in each moment without the overlay of mental commentary, judgment, or wishful thinking. When you see situations clearly, without the distortion of your preferences and fears, the appropriate response often becomes obvious. Michael, a parent dealing with his teenager's rebellion, discovered this during one of the most challenging periods of his family life. His initial response had been to swing between extremes, either trying to control every aspect of his daughter's behavior or giving up entirely and letting her make potentially dangerous choices without any guidance. The middle way taught Michael how to provide structure and boundaries while respecting his daughter's need for independence, how to express his concerns without becoming controlling, and how to maintain connection while allowing her to experience the natural consequences of her choices. This balanced approach required Michael to stay present with each situation as it arose, rather than reacting from his fears about what might happen or his frustrations about what had already occurred. He learned to respond to his daughter's actual behavior rather than to his mental stories about what her behavior meant for her future. The middle way isn't always comfortable because it requires giving up the illusion of control that comes from holding extreme positions. When you're completely committed to one side of any issue, you at least know where you stand, even if your position creates suffering. The middle way requires the courage to remain fluid, responsive, and open to the complexity of real situations. But this apparent uncertainty is actually the foundation of genuine security. When you're not rigidly attached to any particular position, you can respond creatively to whatever arises. When you're not desperately dependent on specific outcomes, you can work toward them with a relaxed effectiveness that actually makes positive results more likely. Your restless mind, your tendency to swing between extremes, your chronic dissatisfaction, wherever you find yourself, these aren't personal failings that need to be eliminated through better self-control. They're invitations to discover the middle way, the balanced engagement with life that makes genuine serenity possible while maintaining complete effectiveness in the world. The peace you seek isn't found by avoiding life's challenges or by grasping them too tightly. It's discovered through the skillful balance that allows you to dance with whatever circumstances arise, while remaining centered in the awareness that is always already free. In our next exploration, we'll see how the three paths we've been traveling, Plato's pursuit of truth, the Stoic acceptance of reality, and the Buddha's middle way, converge into a single understanding that can guide your personal journey toward lasting serenity. A Journey to Serenity, Part 9. The three paths converge. Your personal philosophy of serenity. We've traveled with three great guides to the landscape of human consciousness. Plato, who taught us to distinguish between shadows and reality. The Stoics, who showed us how to accept what we cannot change while taking full responsibility for what we can. And the Buddha, who revealed why we suffer and how that suffering can end completely. Now comes the moment of synthesis. Understanding how these seemingly different approaches actually point toward the same fundamental truth about the nature of serenity. At first glance, these three traditions might appear to contradict each other. Plato emphasizes a pursuit of eternal truth beyond the changing world of appearances. The Stoics focus on accepting reality exactly as it is, while maintaining virtue regardless of circumstances. Buddha teaches that all phenomena are impermanent and that attachment to anything, even virtue or truth, can become a source of suffering. But when you examine these teachings more deeply, you discover that they're describing the same mountain from different paths. Each tradition identified the same core problem. Human beings suffer because they mistake temporary phenomena for permanent sources of fulfillment, and each discovered the same essential solution. Peace comes from aligning yourself with what is ultimately real, rather than chasing what merely appears to be real. Plato's shadows on the cave wall, the Stoics' external circumstances beyond our control, and Buddha's impermanent phenomena that we grasp through craving. These are different ways of describing the same fundamental error. We suffer because we expect the temporary to provide what only the eternal can give. We remain restless because we seek completion through incomplete things. Consider how this plays out in one of the most common sources of modern suffering, the pursuit of identity through external achievements. Whether you're trying to prove your worth through career success, social status, physical appearance, or intellectual accomplishment, you're essentially chasing shadows, attempting to control what's beyond your control, and craving permanence from impermanent phenomena. Jennifer, a marketing executive who had achieved everything she thought she wanted, discovered this convergence during what she calls her philosophical crisis. Despite her professional success, loving relationships, and financial security, she felt a persistent emptiness that none of her achievements could fill. Her encounter with Plato helped her recognize that she had been pursuing shadows, mistaking external recognition for genuine self-worth, confusing temporary accomplishments with lasting meaning, and seeking her identity in roles that were constantly changing. The successful executive was just one temporary form she was taking, not her essential nature. Her study of stoicism taught her to distinguish between what she could and couldn't control. She couldn't control market conditions, client decisions, or her company's strategic direction, but she could control the quality of her effort, the integrity of her character, and her responses to whatever circumstances arose. Her exploration of Buddhism revealed why she had been suffering despite her external success. She had been trying to use impermanent achievements to create a permanent sense of security and self-worth. Every accomplishment had provided temporary satisfaction, followed by the anxiety of needing to achieve more to maintain her identity. The convergence of these three insights created a profound shift in how Jennifer approached her work and life. She continued pursuing professional excellence, but not because she needed it to prove her worth. She accepted the uncertainties and setbacks inherent in any career, but without making her peace depend on favorable outcomes. She cared deeply about her work's quality and impact, but held lightly to the recognition or rewards that might follow. This integrated understanding didn't make Jennifer less ambitious or effective. It made her more creative and sustainable in her approach to achievement. When your fundamental well-being doesn't depend on external validation, you can take the kinds of creative risks that lead to genuine innovation. When you're not desperately attached to specific outcomes, you can work with a relaxed focus that produces the best results. The three traditions converge on another crucial insight. The path to serenity requires both understanding and practice. It's not enough to intellectually grasp these principles. They must be embodied through consistent application to the circumstances of your actual life. Plato emphasized this through his concept of dialectic, the ongoing process of examining your beliefs and assumptions until you distinguish between what you think you know and what you actually know. This isn't a one-time realization, but a lifelong practice of intellectual humility and genuine inquiry. The Stoics developed specific exercises for training the mind: morning reflections on the day ahead, evening reviews of the day that passed, voluntary discomfort to build resilience, and constant practice of the dichotomy of control. They understood that philosophical insights without practical application remain mere concepts. Buddha organized his teachings into the Eightfold Path precisely because he knew that understanding the nature of suffering isn't enough to end it. Liberation requires the systematic cultivation of wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline through practices that gradually transform how you perceive and respond to experience. David, a software engineer struggling with anxiety and perfectionism, discovered the importance of practice when he first encountered these philosophical traditions. Initially, he approached them like any other information to be understood intellectually. He read books, watched lectures, and could articulate the key concepts clearly. But his anxiety remained unchanged because his understanding hadn't yet transformed his daily experience. The breakthrough came when David began actually applying these teachings to specific situations in his life. Instead of just understanding Plato's allegory of the cave, he started questioning his own assumptions about success, failure, and self-worth. Instead of merely grasping the Stoic dichotomy of control, he began practicing it during stressful meetings and challenging projects. Instead of only comprehending Buddhist teachings about attachment, he started noticing his own craving and learning to release it. This shift from understanding to practice required David to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. He discovered that his perfectionism wasn't really about producing excellent work. It was about avoiding the vulnerability of making mistakes. His workaholism wasn't driven by passion for his projects. It was fueled by fear that he wasn't valuable enough without constant achievement. These insights weren't pleasant, but they were liberating. Once David recognized the mental patterns that were creating his suffering, he could begin changing them through consistent practice. Each time he caught himself seeking approval, he could remember that his worth wasn't dependent on others' opinions. Each time he felt anxious about outcomes beyond his control, he could redirect his attention to actions within his power. The convergence of three traditions also reveals that serenity isn't a destination you reach, but a way of traveling through life. It's not a permanent state of bliss that eliminates all challenges, but a fundamental orientation that remains stable regardless of what challenges arise. This understanding helps address one of the most common misconceptions about spiritual or philosophical practice: the belief that you're supposed to reach a point where nothing bothers you anymore. The great teachers weren't immune to pain, loss, or difficulty. Plato faced political upheaval and personal disappointments. Marcus Aurelius dealt with plague, war, and family tragedies. Buddha continued to experience physical discomfort and the sadness of watching loved ones suffer. What distinguished these teachers wasn't the absence of difficult experiences, but their relationship to such experiences. They had learned to face challenges without adding unnecessary suffering through resistance, denial, or desperate attempts to control uncontrollable circumstances. This perspective transforms how you understand your own journey toward serenity. You're not trying to eliminate all sources of stress, sadness, or uncertainty from your life, an impossible task that would only create more suffering. You're learning to meet whatever arises with greater wisdom, acceptance, and inner stability. Sarah, dealing with her mother's progressive dementia, found this understanding crucial during one of the most challenging periods of her life. Initially, she had hoped that philosophical practice would somehow make watching her mother's decline less painful. When the pain remained intense, she wondered whether she was practicing correctly or whether these teachings were actually helpful. The convergence of the three traditions helped Sarah understand that the goal wasn't to eliminate her grief, but to experience it cleanly, without the additional suffering that comes from resisting reality or creating elaborate mental stories about what the situation meant about life's fairness or her adequacy as a daughter. Plato's insights helped Sarah distinguish between her mother's essential being and the temporary conditions affecting her mind and body. The Stoic teachings helped her focus on providing loving care, something within her control, rather than try and prevent the disease's progression, which was beyond anyone's control. Buddhist wisdom helped her accept the impermanence that makes loss inevitable while finding ways to appreciate the love that remains constant despite changing circumstances. This integrated approach didn't eliminate Sarah's sadness about her mother's condition, but prevented that natural sadness from being amplified by mental resistance, self-blame, or desperate grasping for impossible outcomes. She could grieve while maintaining her balance, care deeply while accepting powerlessness over the ultimate outcome. The three paths also converge on a recognition that genuine serenity naturally expresses itself through service to others. When you stop trying to use external circumstances to fill internal voids, you discover that you have something authentic to offer. When you're no longer desperately seeking approval or avoiding rejection, you can respond to others' actual needs rather than unconsciously using them to meet your own psychological requirements. Plato taught that those who glimpse the light beyond a cave have a responsibility to return and help others recognize the difference between shadows and reality. The Stoics emphasize virtue, particularly justice and benevolence, as a natural expression of philosophical understanding. Buddha organized his entire teaching career around the compassionate desire to help others discover the end of suffering. This isn't forced altruism or obligatory service, but the spontaneous overflow of inner peace. When you're genuinely content within yourself, generosity becomes natural rather than effortful. When you're not constantly preoccupied with your own unmet needs, you can perceive and respond to the world around you more clearly and effectively. Michael, a business executive who had been known for his competitive and sometimes ruthless approach to leadership, experienced this transformation as his philosophical practice deepened. As he became less desperate for recognition and control, he found himself naturally becoming more supportive of his colleagues and more interested in developing others rather than just advancing his own career. This shift wasn't calculated or strategic. It emerged organically from his growing inner stability. When you're not constantly defending yourself against perceived threats or grasping for scarce resources, you can afford to be generous with others. When you're secure in your own worth, you can celebrate other successes without feeling diminished by them. The practical question now becomes, how do you determine which elements from each tradition are most relevant to your particular temperament, circumstances, and current challenges? The answer requires honest self-assessment, combined with experimental practice. Some people are naturally drawn to Plato's emphasis on questioning assumptions and seeking truth beyond appearances. If you tend to be intellectually curious and enjoy examining beliefs and ideas, the Platonic approach might provide your primary framework, supplemented by Stoic practices for dealing with practical challenges and Buddhist techniques for working with attachment. Others resonate more with a Stoic focus on accepting circumstances while maintaining virtue. If you face significant external challenges or tend to struggle with anxiety about things beyond your control, Stoic principles might form your foundation, enhanced by Platonic insights about reality and Buddhist understanding of the mind's role in creating suffering. Still others find the Buddhist analysis of craving and attachment most relevant to their experience. If you struggle with addiction, compulsive behaviors, or chronic dissatisfaction despite external success, Buddhist practices might be your starting point. Supported by Platonic wisdom about distinguishing between temporary and eternal goods and Stoic techniques for focusing on what you can control. The key is to experiment with different approaches and notice which ones produce actual changes in your daily experience rather than just intellectual satisfaction. Philosophy isn't about having the right opinions, but about living more wisely. The test of any teaching is whether it helps you respond to real situations with greater peace, clarity, and effectiveness. This experimental approach requires patience because genuine transformation occurs gradually rather than dramatically. You're not trying to change your personality overnight, but to slowly shift the patterns of thought and response that have been developing for years or decades. Lisa, a teacher dealing with burnout and cynicism, found this gradual approach essential to her recovery. She had initially hoped that philosophical study would provide quick relief from her professional frustration, but she discovered that the real benefits came through months of consistent practice applied to her daily classroom challenges. Each time a student was disruptive, she practiced distinguishing between what she could and couldn't control. Each time administrative decisions frustrated her, she worked on accepting circumstances while maintaining her commitment to quality teaching. Each time she felt overwhelmed by the demands of her profession, she practiced returning to the present moment rather than being lost in anxiety about future pressures. These small, consistent applications of philosophical principles gradually transformed Lisa's entire experience of teaching. She remained aware of the systemic problems in education, but stopped making her peace dependent on solving them. She continued caring about her students' progress, but released her desperate attachment to their achievement. She maintained high standards for her work, while finding satisfaction in the effort itself rather than only in measurable results. Your personal philosophy of serenity will be uniquely yours, but will likely include elements from all three traditions because they address different aspects of the same fundamental challenge. You'll need Plato's insight to distinguish between what's real and what's merely apparent. You'll need Stoic discipline to focus on what you can control, while accepting what you cannot. You'll need Buddhist wisdom to release the craving that makes peace dependent on circumstances. The convergence of these paths points toward a simple but profound truth. Serenity is not something you achieve, but something you are when you stop trying to be something else. It's not a feeling you create, but what remains when you stop creating unnecessary suffering through resistance, attachment, and a pursuit of impossible permanence in an impermanent world. Your restless mind, your chronic dissatisfaction, your endless seeking. These aren't problems to be solved, but invitations to recognize what you've always been beneath all the mental activity. The peace you seek through external arrangements is already present, waiting to be discovered whenever you stop demanding that this moment be different from what it actually is. In our final exploration, we'll translate these philosophical insights into practical daily practices that can gradually transform your understanding from intellectual knowledge into lived wisdom. A Journey to Serenity, Part 10. Your daily practice, living the philosophy. The great Roman philosopher Seneca once wrote, "Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end." You've journeyed through the cave with Plato, stood with Marcus Aurelius in his tent, sat with Buddha under the Bodhi tree. You've discovered how their teachings converge into a unified understanding of human serenity. Now comes the most crucial part of this entire journey, the daily practice that transforms philosophical insight into lived wisdom. Here's a truth that all three of our guides understood intimately. Knowledge without embodiment is merely sophisticated entertainment. You can understand every principle we've explored, appreciate their logical coherence, and feel inspired by their promise. But until these insights become woven into the fabric of your daily experience, they remain as distant from your actual peace as stars are from Earth. Plato didn't just theorize about the examined life. He examined his own life daily through rigorous self-questioning. Marcus Aurelius didn't simply teach about virtue and acceptance. He practiced these principles during plagues, wars, and personal losses. Buddha didn't merely explain the nature of suffering. He developed and taught specific practices for transforming the mind's relationship to experience. Your serenity depends not on perfect philosophical understanding, but on imperfect, consistent practice. The path forward isn't about becoming a perfect philosopher, but about becoming a practicing one. And like any worthwhile practice, this begins not with grand gestures, but with small, sustainable steps that accumulate into profound transformation over time. The first element of your daily practice draws from Plato's greatest gift, the art of self-examination. But this isn't the kind of neurotic self-analysis that creates more mental turbulence. Platonic self-examination is about creating space between yourself and your automatic thoughts, reactions, and assumptions. It's about becoming curious about your own mind rather than being completely identified with it. Start each morning with 5 minutes of what we might call philosophical questioning. Before checking your phone, reading the news, or jumping into the day's activities, sit quietly and ask yourself, what am I assuming about today? What do I think I need to happen for me to be okay? What am I taking for granted as true that might actually be just my interpretation of reality? Rachel, a mother of 3 young children, discovered that this morning practice completely changed how she approached her days. Instead of immediately feeling overwhelmed by her mental to-do list, she began to question whether her anxiety was based on actual problems or on her assumptions about what needed to happen perfectly. Instead of starting each day feeling behind, she learned to examine whether her expectations were realistic or whether she was trying to control outcomes beyond her power. The key to effective self-examination is maintaining what Plato called philosophical wonder, approaching your own thoughts and reactions with genuine curiosity rather than harsh judgment. You're not trying to fix yourself, but to understand yourself. You're not seeking to eliminate all troubling thoughts, but to recognize which thoughts are worth taking seriously and which are just mental noise. Throughout the day, practice the Platonic art of distinguishing between appearance and reality. When you feel upset, ask, is this situation actually as bad as it appears, or am I seeing shadows on the wall? When you feel elated by some success, question, is this achievement as meaningful as it seems, or am I mistaking a temporary condition for lasting fulfillment? This isn't about becoming cynical or skeptical about everything, but about developing what Plato called intellectual humility, the recognition that your first interpretation of any situation is probably incomplete and possibly incorrect. The person who cuts you off in traffic might be rushing to see a dying parent. The criticism from your boss might reflect her own stress rather than your inadequacy. The praise you receive might be more about others' needs than your actual merit. The second pillar of your daily practice comes from the Stoics, the systematic application of the dichotomy of control. This isn't a one-time insight, but a muscle that strengthens through consistent exercise. Every challenging situation in your life becomes an opportunity to practice this fundamental distinction. Begin each day by identifying 3 things that will likely challenge your peace: a difficult conversation, a work deadline, a family situation, a health concern. For each challenge, spend a few minutes clearly distinguishing between what you can and cannot control about the situation. Write these down if it helps, using 2 columns, within my control and beyond my control. The Stoics discovered that most of our mental suffering comes from unconsciously trying to control things that are beyond our power, while neglecting the things that are actually within our influence. Your daily practice involves gradually shifting your emotional and mental energy away from the first category and toward the second. David, an entrepreneur dealing with the uncertainty of launching a new business, found this practice revolutionary. Instead of spending mental energy worrying about market conditions, competitor actions, or investor decisions, all beyond his control, he learned to focus intensively on the quality of his product development, the clarity of his communication, and the consistency of his effort, all within his power. This shift didn't eliminate the inherent uncertainty of entrepreneurship, but eliminated the additional suffering that comes from trying to control uncontrollable outcomes. David could work with maximum effectiveness while maintaining inner stability regardless of external results. The Stoic practice of evening reflection provides another crucial element of daily practice. Before sleep, spend 10 minutes reviewing the day that has passed. Ask yourself, where did I waste energy trying to control things beyond my power? Where did I neglect opportunities to exercise control over my responses, attitudes, or actions? What did I handle well? What would I do differently? This isn't about harsh self-criticism, but about gentle course correction. The Stoics understood that wisdom develops through honest assessment of your actual responses to real situations. You're training yourself to notice patterns, the specific circumstances that trigger your automatic reactions, the particular areas where you tend to forget philosophical principles, the situations where you naturally apply these insights effectively. Maria, a nurse working in a high-stress hospital environment, used evening reflection to gradually transform her relationship with the emotional demands of her work. She noticed that she consistently felt drained when dealing with difficult family members of patients, not because of their grief, which was natural and appropriate, but because she was unconsciously trying to make them feel better, something beyond her control. Through consistent evening reflection, Maria learned to distinguish between providing excellent medical care and emotional support within her control, and trying to eliminate others' pain or manage their responses to difficult news beyond her control. This shift allowed her to be more present with suffering families, while protecting her own emotional well-being. The third element of your daily practice draws from Buddha's essential insight, the systematic cultivation of mindfulness and the gentle release of attachment. This begins with the simple practice of returning to present moment awareness whenever you notice that your mind has been lost in anxious thoughts about the future or regretful thoughts about the past. Set gentle reminders throughout your day, perhaps every few hours, to pause and return to your immediate sensory experience. What do you actually see, hear, feel, smell, or taste right now? This is an elaborate meditation, but simple presence. You're training your attention to rest in what's actually happening rather than in your mental commentary about what's happening. The Buddha taught that suffering comes not from experiences themselves, but from our craving for experiences to be different from what they are. Your daily practice involves noticing when you're fighting with reality, wishing this moment were somehow other than it is, and gradually learning to release that resistance. This doesn't mean becoming passive or failing to work for positive change. It means distinguishing between appropriate action toward goals and desperate attachment to specific outcomes. You can work diligently for what you believe is right, while holding lightly to whether your efforts produce the results you prefer. James, a social worker dealing with systemic problems in child welfare, found this distinction crucial for maintaining both effectiveness and sanity in his work. He learned to put maximum effort into each case, while releasing attachment to outcomes often determined by factors far beyond his influence. This allowed him to remain compassionate and engaged without being destroyed by the inevitable disappointments inherent in trying to help people within imperfect systems. The Buddhist practice of loving-kindness meditation provides another daily tool for cultivating the inner peace that naturally expresses itself as genuine care for others. Spend a few minutes each day intentionally extending goodwill toward different categories of people: loved ones, mutual acquaintances, difficult people in your life, and ultimately all beings. This isn't sentimental niceness, but practical wisdom. When you're carrying resentment, anger, or judgment toward others, you're the one who experiences the mental agitation. Loving kindness practice isn't primarily about changing others, but about freeing yourself from the suffering that comes from holding onto negative emotions. The integration of these three approaches, Platonic self-examination, Stoic discipline, and Buddhist mindfulness, creates a comprehensive daily practice that addresses different aspects of mental suffering. Some days you'll need more Platonic questioning to see through illusions. Other days you'll need more Stoic focus on what you can control. Sometimes you'll need more Buddhist acceptance of impermanence and release of attachment. Your practice will evolve as you do. In the beginning, you might need to rely heavily on structured exercises and reminders. Gradually, these insights become more automatic, integrated into how you naturally respond to situations. What starts as conscious practice eventually becomes unconscious wisdom. Sarah, now 3 years into her philosophical practice, describes this evolution. At first, I had to remind myself constantly to question my assumptions, focus on what I could control, and return to the present moment. Now, these responses happen much more naturally. I still practice formally, but the insights have become part of how I automatically approach challenges. The key to sustainable practice is starting small and building consistency rather than attempting dramatic changes that you can't maintain. Choose one element from each tradition that feels most relevant to your current situation. Perhaps morning self-examination, 1 moment of Stoic analysis during your most stressful daily situation, and 1 minute of mindful breathing before sleep. Practice these 3 elements consistently for a month before adding anything else. The goal isn't to have an elaborate spiritual practice, but to have sustainable habits that gradually transform your default responses to life's inevitable challenges. Common obstacles will arise, and anticipating them can help you maintain consistency. You'll sometimes forget to practice, feel too busy, or wonder whether these exercises are actually making any difference. This is normal and expected, not evidence that you're failing or that the approach isn't working. When you notice resistance to practice, examine it with curiosity rather than fighting it. Sometimes resistance indicates that you're trying to do too much too quickly. Sometimes it reflects deeper fears about changing patterns that feel familiar even when they're painful. Sometimes it's simply mental habit preferring the chaos it knows over the peace it doesn't yet trust. The philosophers understood that transformation isn't linear. There will be periods of rapid insight, followed by times when nothing seems to be changing. There will be days when you apply these principles naturally and days when you forget everything you've learned. This isn't regression, but the natural rhythm of any genuine developmental process. Remember that the goal isn't to become perfectly serene, but to become more consistently wise in how you respond to whatever arises. You're not trying to eliminate all sources of stress or challenge from your life, an impossible task that would only create more suffering. You're learning to meet whatever comes with greater inner stability and more skillful responses. The ultimate test of your practice isn't how peaceful you feel during quiet moments of reflection, but how you respond when life tests your understanding through difficult circumstances. Your serenity is genuine when it remains accessible even during periods of loss, disappointment, conflict, or uncertainty. This doesn't mean that you won't feel sadness when you lose someone you love, frustration when plans don't work out, or anger when you encounter injustice. It means that you won't add unnecessary suffering to these natural human responses by resisting them, by demanding that reality be different from what it is, or by making your fundamental well-being depend on circumstances beyond your control. Your daily practice is preparing you for these inevitable tests not by making you invulnerable to life's difficulties, but by giving you reliable tools for working with whatever arises. Each morning self-examination, each moment of stoic refocusing, each return of mindful presence is building your capacity to remain centered regardless of external conditions. The ancient philosophers promised that genuine serenity is possible for any human being willing to undertake the necessary inner work. This isn't a guarantee that your life will become easy, but an assurance that your relationship with difficulty can be fundamentally transformed. Your restless mind, your chronic dissatisfaction, your endless searching, these aren't permanent features of who you are, but habits of thought and response that can be changed through patient, consistent practice. The peace you've been seeking through external achievements and arrangements has always been available within the very awareness that's been doing all the seeking. Begin today. Begin simply. Begin again each time you forget. The wisdom of ages is waiting to be lived through your particular life, in your specific circumstances, through your daily choices to practice rather than merely understand these eternal truths about the nature of human serenity. Your journey to serenity doesn't end with understanding these principles or even with establishing daily practices. It deepens each day as you discover how profound wisdom can be found in the simplest moments of choosing presence over distraction, acceptance over resistance, and love over fear. This is your invitation to live philosophically, not just think philosophically. And in that living, to discover the peace that has always been your birthright.